Hello everyone, I am the Creeps Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was a Tuesday night, late enough that everything felt quiet, but not so late that I couldn't hear the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional bark from a dog somewhere in the neighborhood. I was in the middle of a major argument with my partner. The kind of argument that starts over something small and snowballs into a tangled mess of old grievances and misunderstandings. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in on me, and every word spoken only seemed to make the situation worse. I was pacing back and forth in the living room, not really knowing how to make it stop, how to make her stop. My mind was buzzing, and I could feel the tension in my chest as I struggled to find the right words, the right way to make things make sense. My buddy Jason had been staying over for a couple of days. He was in town on a break from work and had crashed on the couch for the night. He'd been pretty quiet, sitting there watching TV, occasionally offering his thoughts on the argument or making jokes to lighten the mood. But at that moment, he wasn't really part of the problem. He wasn't involved, but he was there, hanging in the background like some uninvited guest at a party that had gone sour. And then it happened. I don't know why or how it happened, but Jason somehow bumped the garage door opener button on the wall next to the front door. It clicked loudly, and before either of us could do anything, the garage door began its slow, creaky descent, halfway down the track before it came to a sudden stop. Normally, this wouldn't be a big deal. Garage doors are finicky sometimes, especially mine. It was full of junk, boxes, old furniture from previous roommates, and random stuff that I never had the energy to deal with. But tonight, in the middle of an argument, it felt like one more thing to manage. One more inconvenience in an already frustrating evening. "I'll go fix it," Jason said, getting up from the couch. His voice was casual, but I could hear the edge of annoyance creeping in. He had just spent the last few minutes half listening to me and my partner yelling at each other. He was probably tired of the noise, tired of the tension, but I didn't blame him. I would have been tired of it too. The thing about my garage is that it's not just full of stuff. It's a mess, a complete disaster. I've had several roommates over the years, and they all left things behind. Half-empty boxes, broken furniture, old bikes, tools, and God knows what else. It was a nightmare to try and move anything around, let alone close a garage door. And with the door stuck halfway down, Jason was going to have to move a bunch of crap around to get it working again. "You gonna be okay in here?" Jason asked as he grabbed the flashlight off the counter and headed for the door. I was still standing in the living room, trying to avoid eye contact with my partner, both of us fuming, neither of us willing to back down. "Yeah," I muttered, barely acknowledging his question. Jason was outside, the faint rustle of him moving boxes and shifting things around barely audible through the walls. The argument inside the house had died down a bit, the air thick with the kind of quiet that only follows a fight like that. My partner had gone to the kitchen, and I was left alone, pacing again, my thoughts spiraling. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I was just frustrated, worn out, trying to make sense of everything, trying to figure out how we had ended up here, how everything had gone wrong. Then it happened. Jason's voice broke through the stillness, sharp and panicked. "What the fuck?" I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The panic in his voice wasn't something I was used to hearing from Jason. He wasn't the type to get rattled by much. I rushed to the door and threw it open, stepping outside into the cool night air. The garage light illuminated the chaotic mess of cardboard boxes, old furniture, and half-hidden tools that were scattered across the floor. But Jason wasn't looking at the mess. He was standing by the far side of the garage, his back slightly hunched, his eyes wide and fixed on something beyond the clutter. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice low, unsure of what I was about to hear. I didn't expect what came next. "I saw a girl," Jason said, his voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. "She ran across the garage from over there." He pointed to the far corner of the garage, near where a broken chair and an old, rusted bike lay. "And she just vanished. Like she phased through the wall. Like she wasn't even there." I blinked, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "A girl? In my garage?" There was no way. I looked around, expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows, but there was no one. The garage was empty, aside from the mess we had to clear out to fix the door. "Wait, what do you mean? like you saw a girl run through the garage, and then, what? She disappeared. Jason nodded, his expression tense. Yeah, man. She ran from that side over there. He gestured again, and just disappeared, like she phased through the wall, or something. She didn't go out the door. She just vanished. The words didn't make sense. How could anyone just vanish like that? And why would someone be running through my garage at this hour? There was no way anyone could have been in there without us seeing them. The garage is attached to the house, and we were in and out of the front door all night. Plus, the place was packed to the brim with crap. No one could have snuck in without us noticing. There was no way anyone was squatting in there either. I had lived in the house for a while, and I knew every inch of it. No one had been in that garage besides us for weeks. You sure it wasn't just a trick of the light? I asked, still trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. No, Jason said quickly. It wasn't like that. I saw her clearly. She didn't look like anyone I knew, and the way she moved, it was all wrong. She was running, but there was no way she could have gotten past all that crap in the way. It's like she just went through the stuff and disappeared. I tried to keep my cool, to tell myself that Jason was just freaking out. He'd been up for days on a bender, and I knew he wasn't exactly in the best state of mind. But this wasn't just some trick of the light. Jason was adamant, and the way he was shaking, the look on his face, it was enough to make me question what I was hearing. Are you sure you're okay, man? Maybe you're just tired, I said, trying to sound calm, but the unease was starting to settle deep in my stomach. Jason looked at me, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. I'm not hallucinating, man. I've been up for a while, yeah, but I know what I saw, and there's no way anyone was in there. I've been outside the whole time, and no one's been in that garage. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't anything. I saw something, and it's still messing with me. I didn't know what to say to that. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I had no explanation for what he saw. No one could have been in there without us knowing. And if he really had seen a girl running through the garage and disappearing, what the hell could that have been? We spent the next few minutes trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. The more we talked about it, the more bizarre it sounded. There was no way to explain what Jason had seen, and it left me with this feeling in my gut, a feeling of something wrong, something out of place. That night, after we managed to get the garage door working again, Jason and I went inside. The argument with my partner had calmed down a bit, but there was still an edge in the air. I couldn't stop thinking about what Jason had said, though. I couldn't shake the image of someone running through my garage and disappearing. What had Jason seen? Had it really been a hallucination? Or was there something else going on? Something that neither of us could understand? The thought that kept creeping into my mind was the idea of parallel worlds. I know it sounds crazy, but what if that's what it was? A brief glimpse into another reality. A person, maybe a girl, running away from something in her own world, and for a split second, she crossed over into ours. It doesn't make sense, but what else could it have been? I didn't bring it up with Jason the next day. He seemed to brush it off, like it was no big deal, but I couldn't help but wonder, if she had been running from something, what was it? Was it something dangerous in her reality? Or was she just trying to get somewhere quickly, unaware that her path had briefly crossed ours? The whole thing still creeps me out. Even now, when I think about it, I feel that chill run down my spine. It doesn't make sense. It shouldn't have happened, but it did, and I don't know what to make of it. I try not to think about it too much, especially before bed. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the air feels heavy, I wonder if I'll ever truly understand what happened that night in the garage. Maybe I never will. The ferry ride to my university isn't usually anything special. It's a fairly standard, mundane part of my daily routine. But this time, I had been studying all day and well into the night, so when I boarded the late-night ferry, I was already pretty tired and a little out of it. I'd taken this ferry countless times before, and I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But it was one of those nights where everything felt just slightly off from the moment I stepped on board. I found my seat, a spot by one of the windows, and sat down. My phone was already in my hands, and I didn't even think about it as I started scrolling through messages, lost in my own little world. The soft hum of the ferry's engines and the sound of people chatting quietly around me were comforting in their normalcy. I glanced out the window, noting how dark and cold the sea looked at this time of night. It wasn't the most scenic view, but it didn't matter. I was too tired to care. That's when I noticed him. There was this man, walking back and forth along the length of the ferry, his eyes scanning every passenger he walked past. He wasn't looking at them in a casual way. He was staring. I'm not talking about the kind of glance you might give someone if you're just passing by them. This was more deliberate, like he was studying each person as if they were part of some puzzle he was trying to solve. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't immediately put my finger on. He was older, probably in his 50s, wearing a leather jacket that looked worn but expensive. He had a scruffy beard and dark, almost too dark sunglasses, even though it was nighttime. His appearance screamed mafia or gangster, like something out of a movie, but not in a glamorous way. More in a cold, intimidating, lived-in way that felt real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and it was like he knew it too, like he was trying to see who would notice him. I texted my friend almost immediately. Weird dude walking back and forth on the ferry, staring at people. Looks like he's in a mafia or something. I'm low-key freaked out. The ferry was only about halfway to the other side, so I tried to go back to my phone, but I couldn't stop glancing over at him. Every time I did, he was either still walking or staring at someone else. It was like he was intentionally making people uncomfortable. I noticed he had been walking for a while now, and each time he passed me, his eyes flicked toward me just a bit longer than necessary. At one point, I started getting that gut feeling, you know? The one that says something's not right, even though you can't put your finger on what it is. Then, as if it was scripted in some twisted way, the man stopped walking and turned toward the exit. I could barely see it, but he headed toward the door that led out to the deck, and a few moments later, I saw another man standing outside on the deck, probably waiting to get to his car. I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed normal. But then I noticed the strange guy from earlier slip out the door behind him, following him. I watched them both go outside, wondering what was going on. I should have been paying more attention, but I was so tired, and the ferry was coming up on the end of its trip, so I assumed everything would be fine. Then, just a minute or so later, it happened. A scream. I heard it clear as day, even though it wasn't really loud. It wasn't like a scream of surprise or someone messing around. It was raw, real fear. The kind of scream that someone would make if they were truly terrified. A full, unrestrained sound that made my blood run cold. The scream only lasted about 2 seconds, but it echoed in my head for what felt like forever. I jerked my head toward the windows, my heart pounding in my chest. Everyone around me seemed oblivious. No one was reacting to it at all, which made me feel even more uneasy. I couldn't understand it. How could no one else hear that? How could no one else even notice something was off? I scanned the other passengers again, but no one seemed to be paying attention. People were chatting quietly, some were on their phones, others were dozing. No one else looked disturbed. My palms were sweaty as I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some kind of misunderstanding, something simple. But the scream, it didn't feel like it was just a normal scream. It felt wrong. As the ferry started approaching the docks, I saw the guy again, standing outside on the upper deck. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop looking at him. The deck was mostly dark, but I could make out his silhouette, watching the passengers leave. His eyes, though they were fixed on me, just staring, like he knew I had noticed him. My chest tightened, and my heart started racing again. It was a feeling of recognition, like he was aware that I knew something was off. Something was wrong about him. Something about the way he watched me, almost as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. I felt trapped. My car was parked in the lot just outside, and I had to leave the ferry, past the dark parking lot, and walk to it alone. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. Was he following me? Was he waiting for me to leave, so he could follow me? I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was being silly, that I was just overthinking it. But deep down, that feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I walked off the ferry quickly, keeping my head down, trying not to look back. But as I passed the parking lot, I glanced over my shoulder, just in time to see the man still standing up there on the upper deck, his eyes locked on me. My heart skipped a beat, and I nearly stumbled. I rushed to my car, the cold night air biting at my skin as I moved faster than I should have, my footsteps echoing in the empty lot. I got to my car and practically threw myself inside. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I had to scrape the ice off the windshield before I could even drive. The cold metal of the scraper felt like a lifeline in my hands, but it didn't help the growing panic inside me. When I finally got the car started and pulled out of the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whole time I drove home, I kept glancing into my rearview mirror, sure that the man was following me. I don't know why I thought that. I didn't see anything, but the fear wouldn't leave. Every turn, every street I passed felt like it was a setup. It was like I was waiting for him to show up, like he was going to appear in my mirror or pull up beside me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, I could feel the tension in my arms. When I finally made it home, I sat in my car for a few minutes, just breathing. My heart was still pounding. I couldn't get that scream out of my head. I couldn't get the image of that man's eyes out of my mind. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. Something had happened on that ferry, something that I didn't understand. The next day, I woke up with the same dread still hanging over me. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to report it. I couldn't just ignore it, not after everything that had happened. I called the police, told them what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I don't know if they did anything with the information, but I felt better knowing that at least I'd done something. I couldn't just let it go, not with how weird everything had felt. Something about that man just didn't sit right with me, and I had to make sure someone else knew about it. The days passed, but the fear didn't go away completely. I was always looking over my shoulder, never quite able to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was out there watching. The summer of 2004 was when things in our new house started getting weird. I was 14 at the time, and we had just moved into this brand new house in a quiet little community in the bottom of a canyon, about 30 minutes north of Los Angeles. The neighborhood was small, just 2 streets, all track homes, the kind of houses where everyone's yard looked the same. But this place had its own vibe, big, spacious houses, but kind of isolated. The roads leading up into the canyon were narrow, winding, sharp curves, the kind of roads you wouldn't want to drive on when it was dark. People got into accidents all the time on those roads. In the nights, I'd sometimes wake up to the sounds of screeching brakes or, more often than not, the thundering echo of a crash. There was something eerie about it. I had learned to block out those noises mostly. The house itself was big, really big for just my family. It was shaped like a sideways U, with 2 side rooms, one on either side of the front, with a long garage extending behind. The kitchen and living room were central, with a long driveway curving up to the garage. French doors lined the courtyard inside the U. The stairs were also in this courtyard, so it wasn't like a regular house. Everything was connected, almost too connected, if that makes sense. It was nice, but a little unsettling, especially since the whole place echoed. It wasn't the kind of place that made you feel cozy, not at first. It made you feel small. But it was our new home, and I had to get used to it. One night, a few days after we moved in, my best friend Lucas came over. He lived up the street, and we were always hanging out together. He brought something with him that night that I would never have imagined would change everything, a brand new Ouija board. I remember feeling kind of uneasy when he brought it over. My mom was superstitious, always believing in things like that, so when she saw the board, she freaked out. She wouldn't let it inside. I remember her telling Lucas, "Take that thing home." But she didn't have to tell me twice. I didn't want it in the house either. But Lucas wasn't having any of that. "Let's just play outside," he said. I guess it didn't seem like such a bad idea, so we set up the board on the driveway, under the glow of the streetlights. My 2 sisters were inside, and the driveway was just wide enough for the 4 of us to sit around it. We asked questions like, "Is anyone here?" The little planchette moved slightly, but I figured Lucas was just nudging it. I wasn't taking it seriously at all. Then we got bold. We asked, "Where did you die?" And the Ouija board spelled out the name of the canyon where we lived. It was kind of a strange coincidence, I thought. "Okay," I said, "that's enough." But Lucas, he wasn't done. He asked, "How did you die?" And the board spelled out car. At that point, I was done with it. "This is stupid," I said, but Lucas wasn't giving up. He asked, "Do you live on our property?" And the board spelled out yes. I thought Lucas was just messing around at this point. He loved that kind of stuff, and I didn't believe in ghosts or anything. But still, something about it gave me the creeps. Maybe it was just the way the air seemed to go still, or the way the lights flickered for a second. I couldn't tell you why, but my stomach turned, and I wanted to go inside. We stopped playing, and I made Lucas take the board home. A couple of days later, my family went to the beach. but I had to stay home. I had this summer school correspondence course I was behind on, so I figured I'd stay inside and get some work done. I hated being alone in that house, though. It was just too big, and it felt like the walls were watching me. So, I decided to do my homework sitting on the stairs. It was the brightest part of the house, and from there, I could see most of the rooms through the French doors. I thought that would be the safest place. I'd been sitting there for a while, doing my homework, when something caught my eye out of the corner of my vision. Someone walked past the courtyard and into the garage. I blinked, thinking it was my mom or one of the painters, but I hadn't heard anything earlier about anyone coming by. I got up, ready to check if everything was okay, but when I walked into the hallway and looked at the garage, I saw the door was completely closed. I knew for a fact I had seen someone walk into it. I even saw their white clothes as they passed by. There was no way I could have mistaken it. Just as I was standing there, confused, I heard my dogs barking from the backyard. They were usually calm, so this wasn't normal. I ran outside to see what was going on, and when I opened the door to the backyard, I saw them, both of them, barking at the wall in the side yard furiously. It didn't make any sense. They were just standing there, fixated on something that wasn't there. I tried calling them back, but they wouldn't listen. Suddenly, I heard clattering from inside the house, loud bangs like furniture was being moved or something. The sound echoed, like something heavy had fallen. And then silence. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like everything had stopped all at once. My heart started racing, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I felt like ice water had been dumped over my head. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't think twice. I ran back around the side yard, through the side gate, and sprinted as fast as I could to my neighbors across the street. I was crying by the time I got there. My neighbor, the husband, was sitting on the lawn, and I could barely get the words out, but when I finally did, his wife immediately called my family. She told them to come home. My neighbor grabbed a golf club, and without asking questions, he walked with me back to my house. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or scared. Scared of what I'd seen, or scared of what might happen next. When we got inside, everything was wrong. Every closet, every cupboard in the first story of the house was open, and every single chair, 8 chairs from the dining room, 6 chairs from the kitchen table, and 4 bar stools around the kitchen island, had been moved exactly 3 feet back from where they had been. It was so precise. The weirdest thing was that nothing had been touched. Nothing had been rummaged through. No valuables were missing. There was no sign that anyone had been inside, but every chair had been moved the same exact way, like someone had gone through and rearranged the entire downstairs while I was outside. We checked with the front gate. The guards swore no one had entered or exited the neighborhood. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, but there was no way it could have been. We had a clear view of my house from the neighbor's lawn. We would have seen anyone leaving. No strange cars had been parked in the driveway. It didn't make sense. My parents came home shortly after, and we all stood there in the living room, looking at each other. My mom, who had been so adamant about not letting the Ouija board in the house, didn't seem to know what to make of it. My dad was confused too, but after looking around and not finding any answers, they decided it was just a neighborhood kid playing a prank. The thing was, I knew every kid in the neighborhood. They all swore they hadn't done it, and even if they had, we would have seen them. There was no way anyone had come in, rearranged the chairs, and then left without us noticing. It didn't add up. We called the police anyway, but they didn't take us seriously. They just told us it was probably a prank and that we should lock the doors and be more careful in the future. They never found anything. No one ever came forward to admit it was a prank, and nothing ever went missing. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me, the feeling that something was off in that house. My sister would always say that the medicine cabinet in her bathroom would slam open and shut on its own from time to time. My older brother, a big guy who wasn't easily scared, started sleeping on the couch in one of the front rooms whenever he came home from school. He'd wake me up in the middle of the night, shaking, saying someone was trying to get in the front door. The doorknob would rattle violently. I'd look out the window above the door, but no one was there. It got to the point where I'd wake up and find him on my trundle bed in the morning, asleep. No one had to say anything. We both knew why. After a couple of years, we moved. But the memories didn't fade. Every time I drove past that neighborhood, I'd get a strange feeling. It was like the house had left something behind. I never figured out what happened that day or why things were so weird in that house. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. but something was off. I could feel it in my bones, and for the first time in my life, I learned to trust that feeling. I remember the first time I went to the Osteen house. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it, but it was the first time I'd gotten the courage to actually walk up to it. The house itself looked like something out of a nightmare, a plantation-style mansion, the kind you'd expect to see in one of those old horror movies. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and it was said to be haunted, which made it a perfect spot for my friends and me to mess around with during high school. It was located way out in the middle of nowhere, on the outskirts of Osteen, Florida. The roads were dirt, narrow, and mostly hidden under thick, overgrown trees. Even in the daytime, the place was covered in a suffocating blanket of shadows. Dense, twisted trees hung low over the path, their branches tangled in the air like they were trying to keep us out. At night, the place felt even worse. The woods were alive with noises, croaking frogs, hissing insects, and the occasional distant growl of something bigger. The air was thick, humid, and smelled like damp earth, rotting leaves, and something almost metallic. The Osteen house stood far from the nearest neighbor, isolated by a thick forest that felt like it could swallow you whole. The mansion itself had been abandoned for who knows how long, but it was clear that no one had taken care of it in ages. The once proud white columns were now gray and cracked, the porch sagged, and the entire building seemed to lean toward one side like it was just waiting to collapse. The windows were broken in places, and in others, the glass was covered with a layer of grime and mold that you could barely see through. But the worst part of it, the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a normal, quiet place. No, this was different, like the silence of a graveyard, the kind of dead air that creeps into your bones. At first, when we went there as kids, it was just to be scared. A group of us would pile into one of our old cars, drive out to the house, and sneak around the place like we were some sort of urban explorers. None of us knew much about the history of the house, but rumors about the place were endless. Some people said it was built by a wealthy family who vanished under strange circumstances. Others claimed that it had once been a sanctuary for people into occult rituals, that it had been the site of unspeakable events. No one ever bothered to try to find out the truth. It was enough just to go there, poke around, and scare the hell out of each other. The first time I ever set foot inside, the floorboards creaked under my feet like they were alive, and the air inside was thick with dust and decay. The smell of mildew and old wood filled my nostrils, but it was something else that I noticed right away. There were symbols on the walls. Not just any symbols, these were clearly drawn in a way that felt intentional, ritualistic even. Red-painted pentagrams, strange goat-like figures, and lines of chalk on the floor that formed strange patterns, like someone had been trying to summon something. It didn't look like something a group of bored teenagers would do. This was more deliberate, like whoever had been here knew what they were doing. The candles scattered throughout the rooms, most of them long burned out, only added to the eerie atmosphere, like the place had once been used for some kind of ritual. We'd spent hours wandering around in that house, exploring rooms full of rotting furniture, broken windows, and dark corners that you couldn't quite see into. Each time we went, we noticed something new, an old portrait with a strange look in its eyes, or a set of stairs that led nowhere but up into a dark, empty void. There were always more symbols, more signs of things that shouldn't be there. But every time, we'd end the night laughing it off, thinking we were just letting our imaginations get the best of us. But this one night, this one particular time, it was different. It was a few weeks after we'd graduated high school, and we were all back in town, hanging out, bored out of our minds. One of us, I think it was Mike, suggested we go back to the Osteen house. By that point, we were all kind of over it. We'd done it so many times, it wasn't as scary anymore. But this time, something felt off. We piled into a car anyway, mostly just to kill time. It was late, probably around midnight, when we drove down that familiar dirt road again. The trees on either side seemed thicker than usual, like the woods had grown even denser since the last time we were there. As we got closer to the house, everything started to feel heavier. The air was thick and sticky, like it was pressing down on us. And even though we were all together, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. We came to a stop about 50 yards from the house, our headlights cutting through the dark, revealing the outline of the mansion. It looked just as run down as the last time we'd seen it, but something about it now made it seem wrong. Like it had changed in some way, like something had happened while we weren't there. As we got out of the car, we all stood there for a moment, just looking at the house. There was an odd, eerie stillness in the air, like everything around us was holding its breath. That's when I noticed something strange. On the third floor, in one of the top windows, there was a small flicker of light. A candle. Someone had lit a candle in the window, and the glow of it was barely visible through the grime-covered glass. We all froze, staring at it in confusion. We had been walking toward the house for a while, and there was no way anyone could have snuck past us to light that candle. We would have seen them. We all knew that. The candle had to have been lit after we started walking up to the house, and that meant someone had been watching us. My heart started to race. We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. No one moved. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves and the steady hum of bugs in the air. But even that felt too loud, too present. Someone was up there, watching us. Mike suggested we go inside, but I didn't want to. Something felt wrong. But against my better judgment, I followed them up the porch steps. The wood creaked loudly under our feet, the sound echoing through the night air. We crept inside, the darkness swallowing us whole. The candlelight from the top window was faint, but we could still see it flickering. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards under our weight. We started exploring again, moving through the rooms one by one, but the further we went, the more the air seemed to close in around us. Every time I glanced back at that window, the candle was still there, glowing in the darkness. And then I heard something, a faint sound, something scurrying across the floor. I thought it was just one of the others, but when I turned around, no one was behind me. The air grew colder, and I felt my skin crawl. We kept moving, but each room felt more oppressive than the last. The walls seemed to close in on us, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter. Finally, we made our way to the stairs that led to the third floor, where that candle flickered. The air was thick with tension as we ascended the stairs, one by one. As we reached the top, the candlelight seemed brighter now, almost unnaturally so. But there was no one there. No one in the room. Just the candle, burning steadily. The faint smell of wax and smoke in the air. We couldn't get out of there fast enough. Without another word, we turned and bolted for the front door. Our footsteps echoed in the silence, too loud now. We stumbled over ourselves to get outside, the door slamming shut behind us with a force that made the whole house seem to shudder. We ran back to the car without looking back. None of us spoke as we drove away. It wasn't until we were on the main road, the Osteen house far behind us, that we even breathed a sigh of relief. We never went back. The Osteen house was eventually demolished by the county. I don't know who did it or why, but part of me is thankful. I don't know what we were messing with back there, but I don't think we ever fully understood the gravity of it. That night, we learned to respect the places we don't belong. Some things, like that house, are better left to rot in the dark corners of the world. And I'll never forget that candle in the window. When I was about 10 years old, my house was always full of energy. I had 2 siblings, and at that time, 4 of our cousins were living with us. That meant there were 7 of us kids running around, all in different stages of growth, all trying to find our own space, and more often than not, competing for attention. It wasn't the largest house, but it was ours, and it felt like a mini world inside those walls. One afternoon, my parents went out to run some errands, leaving us at home to fend for ourselves. At that age, we were used to being left alone, but only for short periods. We weren't little kids anymore, but we still had to follow the basic rules of no fights, no injuries, and no broken things. With my parents gone, we decided to pass the time by playing a game in the family room. It was one of those simple board games, nothing special, just something to keep us occupied. We sat in a circle, focused on the game. The room was quiet except for the sound of the game pieces being moved and the occasional laugh or comment. My cousin Zach, who was about the same age as me, was seated next to me. We were all in a relaxed state, laughing and teasing each other. There wasn't much else to do, so the atmosphere was casual, almost carefree. The rest of the cousins were scattered around the circle. There was Jenny, the older cousin who often took charge of everything, and the 2 younger cousins, Max and Lily, who always seemed to be more interested in each other's jokes than the game itself. As we sat there, something unexpected happened. The sound of my grandmother's voice suddenly echoed through the room, clear and loud, like she was standing just inside the doorway. "Zachary," she called, her voice as distinct as if she had been there in person. It was her voice, no doubt about it. In an instant, all 7 of us froze. For a second, no one moved, unsure of what had just happened. We all exchanged confused looks, trying to make sense of it. Now, Zach was the cousin who was closest to my grandmother. She had always doted on him, and he shared a special bond with her. So, naturally, when we heard her call his name, we all assumed she was there, just as we'd often heard her do when she came over to visit. The thing is, we hadn't heard the door open or the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Our parents weren't home, and we hadn't been told that Grandma was coming over. This was a mystery that none of us could explain at that moment. Without really thinking about it, we all jumped up from the circle, eager to see her. It was automatic, like we were all so used to Grandma coming by that we didn't need any further explanation. We rushed out of the room, our feet clattering on the wooden floor as we made our way through the house. The kitchen, which was just off the family room, was empty. We glanced around, expecting to see her walking through the door any second. There was no sign of her. No car in the driveway. No movement. My older sister, Jenna, headed for the back door and opened it, calling out to see if maybe Grandma had entered the yard through the side gate. She stood there for a few moments, scanning the area, and came back inside just as confused as the rest of us. It wasn't like Grandma to sneak around or not tell us she was coming. She was always very punctual about letting us know when she was visiting, and her visits always followed a set pattern. But here we were, standing in the middle of the house, wondering what had just happened. We checked every room, one by one, just in case we had missed something. The front door was still locked, and no one had entered through the back. We went out to the porch and looked down the street, hoping to see a car in the distance. Nothing. Not a single sign of Grandma or any other familiar face. At this point, we were all trying to piece it together. The voice we'd heard didn't sound like it had come from outside. It was too close, too real. And there was no mistaking it. She had definitely called Zach's name, and we'd all heard it. Max and Lily, the younger cousins, started to get a little anxious. They could sense the shift in the atmosphere. We were used to strange things happening in that house, but this felt different. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans that old houses sometimes make. This was something more. After several minutes of searching, we all gathered back in the family room. There was no explanation, no sign of Grandma, no clue where the voice had come from. We all stood in a circle again, each of us trying to make sense of it in our own way. Jenny, who was usually the one to take charge in moments like this, was unusually quiet. It was clear that even she was shaken. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened in that house. There had been other incidents that made the hairs on the back of our necks stand up, but this one felt like it had crossed some invisible line. The house had always had its quirks, doors that would creak open on their own, the lights flickering at odd times, and even things going missing, only to turn up in places they hadn't been before. But this was different. This was a voice that none of us could explain. We spent the next few hours trying to forget about it, but it lingered in the back of our minds. We kept looking over our shoulders, glancing around corners, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. The house was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. When my parents finally came home, they didn't mention anything about Grandma. They didn't bring her up at all. We didn't know whether to tell them what had happened or not. It felt too strange, too surreal to share. But we knew something had happened, something we couldn't explain. The next day, we asked Grandma if she had called Zach's name the previous afternoon. She looked at us like we were all crazy and told us she hadn't been near our house in days. We couldn't help but feel unsettled. It didn't make sense. We were all so sure of what we had heard. And yet, Grandma wasn't there, and neither were my parents when the voice came through. As the days passed, we tried to move on. But the memory of that moment stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. It became one of those unspoken things that we all carried with us, each of us wondering if anyone else was as disturbed by it as we were. We didn't talk about it much, but every time we walked through that family room, I felt the weight of it. Over the years, there would be more strange events in that house. Things that didn't make sense, things that still don't have an explanation. But none of them quite matched the feeling that came from that afternoon. The feeling that something had reached out to us, something unseen, something that we couldn't touch or fully understand. And in the end, maybe that's what stuck with me the most. The fact that we couldn't explain it, and maybe we were never meant to. Maybe there are some things we just aren't supposed to understand. I still think about that day sometimes and wonder if any of us will ever really figure out what happened. Maybe we won't. Maybe we're not supposed to. But that voice, clear and unmistakable, will always be there in my memory, no matter how many years go by. The house we moved into had an old-world charm that was both captivating and unsettling. It was a 3-story Victorian building, constructed at the turn of the century. The paint was chipped, the woodwork creaked, and the entire place seemed to have a long history, something that whispered to me every time I stepped inside. My husband and I had always dreamed of owning a place like this, and when the opportunity came up, we couldn't resist. We bought it quickly, along with my grandmother, who had been living with us for a while due to her health. When we first moved in, I couldn't ignore the fact that the house had its quirks. It was huge, with large rooms that echoed, high ceilings that made it feel even more cavernous, and a long, narrow hallway that led to a small stairwell. The garden outside was well kept, but needed some attention. It had a rustic charm with wildflower patches, a stone bench tucked away behind some ivy, and a large oak tree that gave the place an almost ancient feel. At the time, we didn't think too much about the house's history. All we knew was that it had been owned by a single woman for many years before it was sold to a man, and then it came to us. There was something about the house that felt like it had been frozen in time, and it made me wonder about the people who had lived there before. It didn't take long before we realized that the house needed a lot of work. There were things we could live with for a while, old carpets that smelled of dust, broken window latches, and peeling wallpaper, but other things had to be fixed right away. We hired the neighbor next door, a builder, to help with some of the more urgent repairs. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with a thick Scottish accent. He seemed like a straightforward person, not one to indulge in small talk, but he was friendly enough. I didn't think much of it when he started helping us, especially since my grandmother would often visit my parents in another city for a week or so, which gave us some breathing room to work on the house. One day, while she was away, the builder mentioned something in passing. We were standing in the living room when he said, "Your grandmother is always out working on the garden. It looks great." I paused for a moment, not sure if I had heard him correctly. "What do you mean? She's not even here. She's visiting my parents." He looked at me, his face puzzled. "No, I've seen her. She's been out there every day working on the garden. White hair and all." I didn't know how to respond. I thought about the fact that my grandmother hadn't been home for days, and the builder had clearly seen someone in the garden. But I didn't mention anything to him at the time. He was superstitious, and I didn't want to get him worked up about something that didn't make sense. After all, it had to have been a mistake, right? But that thought stuck with me. The image of a woman with white hair standing out there in the garden, working away, just as he described. I didn't know who it could have been, but it definitely wasn't my grandmother. I kept the thought to myself, not wanting to stir up anything unnecessary. It wasn't long before other things started happening that didn't make any sense. It started subtly, like small noises at night that I couldn't explain. Doors creaked open when no one was there, and the dogs would start barking at nothing. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the house settling. But then, things started to feel different. Unsettling, almost like there was someone else in the house with us. One evening, while we were sitting at the dinner table, I glanced up at the hallway. The dogs were whining at something, low, almost nervous whines, and it made me feel uneasy. As I looked up, I saw it, a dark figure, tall and massive, ducking behind the doorframe at the far end of the hallway. It was as though it had been watching us and suddenly tried to hide. The figure was cloaked in something black, almost like a huge hooded cloak, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't the shape of a person I could recognize. It was too big, too imposing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. I blinked and looked again, and the figure was gone, as though it had vanished. My heart was racing in my chest. I had to remind myself to breathe. The dogs had gone silent now, but I still felt the weight of that presence lingering in the house. I could feel my pulse quicken, and I found myself standing up from the table, looking over my shoulder into the dark hallway. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't find the words. My mind was racing with questions, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. After that, I avoided the hallway as much as possible. I didn't go near it unless I had to, and even then, I always made sure the lights were on. I couldn't explain it, but that feeling of being watched was so strong, and every time I walked down that hall, I felt the weight of something lurking just beyond my reach. I never told my husband about what I had seen, not because I didn't trust him, but because I was afraid. I didn't want him to think I was imagining things, or worse, that I was losing my mind. But every time I walked past that doorframe, I felt that same gnawing fear. The next few days were strange. The house felt off. It was like the air had thickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The dogs had become more skittish, always barking at the same corner of the room, or whining near the windows, like they were sensing something I couldn't see. I spent more and more time outside, tending to the garden with my grandmother when she came back from her trip. It was the only place that felt normal, even though my mind kept returning to the strange things that had been happening inside the house. I also noticed that the builder had become more distant. He didn't speak much when he came over, but he seemed to be looking over his shoulder when he was working. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but I could swear that he was avoiding certain parts of the house. He'd always been the type to focus on his work, never lingering in places that didn't need attention, but lately, he seemed uncomfortable when he was near the hallway or the stairs. Then, one afternoon, I was outside in the garden when I noticed something. The dogs had started barking frantically near the back fence, and I could hear something moving through the brush. I rushed over to see what it was, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the edge of the garden, there was nothing there. The dogs had quieted down, their tails tucked between their legs. They stared into the woods, alert but uncertain. That evening, after dinner, I went back inside and decided to walk through the house again. The hallway seemed darker than usual, the shadows creeping farther into the room than they had before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching me. I quickly turned on every light I could find, even the ones that weren't necessary. I made my way to the stairwell, my hand gripping the railing tightly. As I reached the top, I glanced down the hall. The door to the back bedroom was ajar, and I thought I saw something move behind it. I didn't dare go closer. Instead, I retreated to the living room, where my grandmother was sitting. I didn't tell her what had happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, about the builder's words, and about the strange noises that had been getting worse. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house much longer without knowing the truth. The next day, I did something I had been avoiding for weeks. I spoke to the neighbor again. He was in his yard, working on a project, and I casually asked him if he'd seen anything unusual. At first, he was hesitant, but then he seemed to think about it for a moment. He told me that there was something odd about the house, something he couldn't put his finger on. He said he had seen strange shadows, flickering lights, and even heard footsteps when no one was around. His voice dropped to a whisper as he told me about the rumors surrounding the house, about its history and the woman who had lived there. After that conversation, I knew I had to leave. The fear had built up to a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't the house itself, but the strange presence that seemed to live inside it. I packed up our things, told my grandmother that we were moving, and left the house for good. I couldn't explain what happened, and I didn't want to know. I just wanted to be far away from it. I never spoke to the builder again, and I never went back to that house. It's been years now, but I still think about it sometimes. The feeling of being watched, the dark figure, and the strange, unsettling noises, they'll stay with me forever. I don't know what it was, but I'll never forget the sense of dread that seemed to follow me wherever I went in that house. Maybe it was just the old house settling, or maybe there was something more to it. Either way, I'm glad I left when I did. Some things are better left unexplained. When I was around 12, I spent a lot of my summers at my cousin's house. He was about 9, and we were pretty much inseparable when it came to figuring out ways to pass the time. His house was in an older neighborhood, one that felt like it had seen better days. There were a lot of houses with overgrown lawns, cracked sidewalks, and broken streetlights. The kind of neighborhood where kids used to play outside all day. But now it felt like everyone just stayed inside. It had a kind of eerie quiet, especially at night. No one really talked about it, but you could tell the place was slowly decaying. Maybe it was the houses falling apart or the trees that seemed to be choking on the pollution in the air, but it felt like something was off. And that's what made it the perfect place for mischief. My cousin and I had a favorite spot, the trampoline. We spent hours bouncing on it, flipping, trying stupid tricks, and basically just goofing off. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and it was the one thing that kept us distracted from the other things that felt wrong in the neighborhood. But this one summer day, we decided to step things up a notch. We had always seen the old house on the other side of my cousin's fence. It was an abandoned property, right at the edge of the block. The house was probably older than both of us put together, and it was as creepy as it was intriguing. We'd heard rumors from the older kids, stories about it being haunted, about people seeing strange things inside. But those were just rumors, right? Nothing that could keep us away. It was a challenge, something we had to do. So, we got this bright idea to sneak over there. We weren't exactly prepared. No shoes, just bare feet against the dirt and gravel path leading to the back of the house. But we didn't care. We climbed up the chain-link fence easily and slipped between it and the side of the old house. The fence was old, too, barely standing upright in places, and it creaked and groaned as we pushed past it. It didn't even seem like anyone had been back there in years, except for maybe a few curious animals, and who knows what else. The smell hit us first. It was like the air was thick with something sweet, almost sickeningly so. It wasn't the kind of sweet you'd get from candy or flowers. It was heavy, stale, and clung to the air like it had been trapped inside for decades. We both held our noses instinctively as we made our way to the front of the house. The house was pretty rundown, but the front door caught my attention. It was modern steel and had a lock on it. That seemed strange for an abandoned house. But then again, we were 12, and logic didn't exactly factor into the equation. We tried the handle, and to our surprise, it opened. The door creaked as it swung inward, and we stepped into the dark, musty interior. The smell intensified, almost making me gag, but I ignored it. We were already committed now. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floors were covered in dust, and the air felt thick with neglect. No one had lived here for a long time. That was clear. There were no shattered windows or glass on the floor, which was a relief since we were barefoot. But the dust, God, the dust was everywhere. We walked slowly, carefully, like the house might collapse on us at any second. It wasn't a big place, just a shotgun house with 4 rooms. The first room we entered was the living area, and it was filled with random old stuff. There were a bunch of mountain bikes piled up in the corner, some with flat tires, others missing handlebars. We looked at each other, confused. Who would leave bikes here? Were they abandoned too? There were no signs of anyone living there, though. It felt like a storage unit more than a home. In the corner of the room was a small bathroom, its door slightly ajar. We wandered inside, curious. It was small, like something out of the past. There were old glass bottles lined up on the counter, some clear, some cloudy with age, all covered in dust. They looked like they'd been there since the 1940s, or maybe earlier. They were too delicate to touch, and we weren't interested in exploring that further. We both knew enough not to mess with things that might be dangerous, but curiosity had us moving through the rooms quickly. The second room wasn't much different. It was packed with more junk, old furniture, boxes, and a whole lot of broken things. But something in the corner caught my eye. It was a cassette player. It was old, the kind you used to see in your grandma's house, with a chunky plastic design and buttons that were worn down from years of use. And in the cassette player was a tape. The label on it read Deborah, March 18, 1993. My cousin and I exchanged a glance, but we didn't think much of it. It was just a tape, right? Nothing special. We didn't touch it. We weren't in the mood for whatever it might have been about. There was no point. The third room was pretty much the same, more bikes and junk, and a small closet off to the side. We went inside and shoved the cobwebs away, only to freeze when we saw what was inside. There, in the corner of the closet, was a chainsaw. It looked rusty, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. The residue on the blade was a deep red brown, like dried blood. I tried to convince myself it was just rust, just some old chainsaw that had been sitting there for years. But my gut told me something wasn't right. We both felt the tension rising in the air. Something was off. There was an unease creeping in, but we couldn't put our finger on it. So, we did what any curious 12-year-old would do. We decided to check the last room and then get out. We didn't need to be told twice. We were both on edge, but we didn't want to look like we were scared. The fourth room was almost completely empty. There was a set of stairs leading down to the basement, covered in dust, and a small wooden cross placed in the center of the room. It was old, like something you'd see in an old church or graveyard. The paint was peeling off, but it still had the words painted on it. Deborah, September 29th, 1963 to March 18th, 1993. The same name, the same date. I didn't know what it meant, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Then, just as we were about to turn around and leave, we heard it. A thump. A loud, heavy thump from the basement, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. That was it. We bolted. I didn't even think about it. We ran out of that room, through the hallway, and out the front door. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short bursts. We didn't stop running until we were back in my cousin's yard, hopping over the fence and racing into his house like a pair of scared animals. We locked ourselves in his room and crawled under the bed. We didn't say a word to each other, but we both knew we were thinking the same thing. That house wasn't abandoned. Someone, or something, was still there. We spent the next few hours lying there, whispering in the dark, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We promised each other we would never go back to that house, that we would never step foot on that property again. But of course we did. We were kids, after all. And that's how we found ourselves back there a few days later, trying to convince ourselves that what we had experienced wasn't real. But when we got there, the house was gone. The lot was empty, the foundation was all that remained, and the entire place had been torn down. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest, but at the same time, it left me with a strange emptiness. I didn't know whether to be relieved or disappointed. But honestly, I think I was just glad it was gone. That's when I realized something. Sometimes, the scariest part of an experience is the feeling you get when you realize it was all too real. That house wasn't some forgotten relic of the past. It was a reminder of things that should have stayed buried. And even though it's gone now, I don't think I'll ever forget what we found there. I don't think I'll ever forget Deborah. It had been a long week, and the cold weather wasn't helping my mood at all. I had made an appointment to view an apartment in a quieter part of town, one of those areas that feels a little off the beaten path. It wasn't dangerous or anything, just industrial and out of the way. Not many people were around, and the place felt a bit lonely. I had done the usual, checked the listing online, made sure it had everything I was looking for, and confirmed the appointment with the real estate agent. I was hoping this place would be it. The last thing I needed was another place that looked good online, but turned out to be a dump in person. I showed up early, as usual, but the agent wasn't there yet. No big deal, though. I had nothing else planned that day, so I waited. 10 minutes turned into 20, and then 20 became 30. I checked the time on my phone again. It was cold, really cold, about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. My breath was fogging in the air as I stood outside the apartment, hands shoved deep in my coat pockets. I hadn't seen a soul walk by in all that time. The wind was picking up, the kind of cold that chills you right down to your bones, and I started wondering if I was just wasting my time. At that point, I decided to leave. Maybe the agent forgot or something came up. I wasn't sure, but I wasn't about to freeze for nothing. I got back in my car and started the engine, trying to get the heat going. As I turned the key, the car's heater kicked on, and I immediately felt a little better. I made the first right turn out of the neighborhood, heading back toward the main street. The road was empty, and I could see the glow of the streetlight ahead, the red light signaling that I would have to stop. The cold wind outside kept tugging at my coat as I drove, and I focused on the warmth creeping through the vents. When I stopped at the light, I looked out the window. On the corner across from me was a liquor store. Just past that, a little cafe that didn't look like much. And then I saw him. The kid. He was standing there, staring at the cafe, looking lost. No parent in sight. It wasn't unusual to see kids on their own now and then, especially with the way things were these days. Maybe he was just waiting for someone, or maybe he wandered off from a nearby store. But then I saw the man. He was walking down the street with the boy, but instead of stopping at the cafe with him, the man walked into the liquor store. The kid just stood there. No one else seemed to notice him, but I couldn't stop looking at him. The boy was tiny, no older than 4 or 5 maybe. He had dark brown skin, maybe Asian, and his black hair was blowing in the wind, making it look messy. He was clutching a small green book in his hands like it was the most important thing in the world, and his little face was scrunched up in tears. He wasn't crying like most kids do. It wasn't just a random sob here and there. It was the kind of crying you see when a child is really scared, like the kind of panic you feel when you can't find your mom in a crowded store. His face was red, his eyes wide with fear, and his mouth quivered. I felt a chill run through me. The boy was out there alone, and the wind was cutting through me even in my car, let alone the boy out there in that thin jacket. I watched him for a moment, wondering where his father had gone. The man had walked into the liquor store without a second glance at him, and now the boy was standing there in the cold, looking around desperately, as if he was searching for someone. I turned my attention back to the light. It was still red, and the few seconds felt like minutes. I just kept watching him, trying to figure out if someone would show up, if anyone would notice him. But no one did. A few people passed by on the sidewalk, oblivious to the boy standing there crying. No one stopped. No one looked at him. My eyes kept locked on him as I waited for the light to change. He walked up to the window of the cafe, pressing his little hands against the glass as he peered inside. He must have been looking for someone in there, but no one noticed him either. The boy turned around, his eyes still wet with tears, and I could see him focus on me. He looked directly at me, and for a few seconds, we just stared at each other. His crying face, his dark, wet eyes locked on mine, pleading for something, anything. It felt like a moment that lasted forever, but it was only a few seconds. There was something about the look in his eyes, something that made me feel like I needed to do something. I couldn't just leave him out there like that. The wind was howling around us, and the temperature was plummeting. I watched as he stood there, his little body shivering in that thin jacket, gripping the green book to his chest like it was the only thing keeping him together. I made up my mind. As soon as the light turned green, I was going to pull over. I was going to get out of my car and wait with him. It was the right thing to do, wasn't it? What if he had gotten lost? What if he didn't know where his dad went? It wasn't normal for a kid to be left alone like that, especially in weather like this. I could help him. I could at least wait with him until someone came to get him. The moment the light turned green, I slammed my foot on the gas. But before I could make it to the curb, an SUV pulled up beside me. I glanced over quickly, distracted for a second, and in that instant, the boy stopped crying. The sound of his sobbing disappeared, and I couldn't see him through the windshield anymore. I cursed under my breath as the SUV zoomed ahead, making it impossible for me to pull over. I quickly checked the area where he had been standing. My heart skipped a beat. There was no boy. He was gone. I scanned the sidewalk and the road, looking frantically for him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. No small figure in a blue jacket, no tiny green book clutched in his hands. I even quickly glanced into the cafe, just in case he had gone inside, but the place was empty. The liquor store, too, no one in there. The street was still quiet, but the boy had vanished completely. I sat there for a moment, feeling my heartbeat thud in my chest. My thoughts were racing. Where had he gone? How could he have disappeared that fast? I had been watching him just seconds before, and now nothing. Not a single sign of him. I looked down the road, but the street was empty. No one had walked past him. No one had picked him up. It was just as if he had disappeared into thin air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I quickly checked my rearview mirror to make sure I hadn't missed anything, but still nothing. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. I tried to make sense of it, tried to explain it away. Maybe I had been imagining things. Maybe I hadn't seen him as clearly as I thought I had. But I knew that wasn't the case. The moment we had locked eyes, I had felt something. It wasn't normal. I drove home that night in complete silence. I couldn't stop thinking about that boy, about the way he had been standing there in the cold, crying, and then just gone. No one else had seemed to notice him. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. There had to be some logical explanation. Maybe I had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe it was just a coincidence that I happened to be the only one who saw him. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I went back to the area, driving around and checking the street corner where I had seen him. I even stopped by the liquor store and the cafe to ask if anyone had seen anything unusual the night before. But no one remembered anything. The liquor store clerk didn't recall any kid being there, and the cafe workers hadn't seen anyone matching his description. It felt like I was chasing ghosts, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. I don't know what happened to that boy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something strange that night. It felt like a moment that was frozen in time, something that slipped through my fingers the moment I blinked. I still think about him sometimes. I don't know if he was lost, if he needed help, or if I was just in the right place at the wrong time. But I can't forget those eyes, locked onto mine for those few seconds. I can't forget the crying, the way his small, fragile body looked out there alone in the cold, and then, just as quickly, gone. And I still can't figure out what the hell I saw. The house I lived in from when I was about 13 until I was 24 had some kind of darkness hanging over it, something I could never fully shake. When I was a kid, my parents told me the previous owner's son had overdosed, but not in the house. It happened somewhere else. Even so, that little tidbit always stuck with me. Maybe it was the way they said it, with that strange pause in their voices, or how my mom would sometimes lower her voice when she'd mention it. I don't know, but it creeped me out a little, and I'd always end up thinking about it late at night when I was alone. Something about the house had a weight to it, something off, and that only got worse as the years went on. From the very start, I noticed things. Little things, like hearing floorboards creak when no one was around, the sort of thing that would make you question if you just hadn't been paying attention before. The most obvious thing, though, was the glass cube wall in the living room. It was one of those outdated, 80s design features that didn't make much sense, separating the living room from the dining room with nothing but glass blocks. At night, when I stayed up late watching movies or gaming, I'd see shadows dart across the wall. Always quick, always out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought I was just tired or imagining things, but after a while, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time I'd check, no one would be there. It would just be me, sitting there in the dark with the low hum of the TV or computer, feeling like I was being watched. There was one night when I was about 15 that really did it, though. I was in bed, half asleep, drifting in and out. My room was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every little noise, like a creaking floorboard or the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The kind of quiet where your mind just wants to wander, and you're half in a dream but still somewhat awake. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was the temperature change or a sound in the house. It's hard to pinpoint it now, but I remember waking up, my eyes blinking in the dark. My HP laptop was on the desk next to my bed, and it emitted this soft, blue light when closed. It was faint enough that I could see the time if I squinted, but not bright enough to make the room feel less dark. I was just lying there, looking at the time on my watch, about 2 a.m., or maybe a little later. The light from the laptop was the only thing that lit up the room, and the rest was pitch black. Then I heard it. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like a whisper, but so close, right next to my ear, that it felt like it was inside my head. A soft, low whisper that didn't make sense at first, but it felt like it was trying to get my attention. My name. It was my name, but I couldn't place where it had come from, who it had come from. I remember freezing, just lying there in shock. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, because something told me if I moved, if I reacted, the moment would vanish. But it didn't. The whisper came again, clearer this time, like it was just a hair's breadth away from my ear. I don't know how long I lay there, too afraid to move, too afraid to open my eyes fully. But when I finally snapped out of it, I felt this rush of panic. I jumped out of bed, and I was up and scrambling before I even realized what I was doing. I knocked things off my desk, almost tripped on the edge of the bed, and didn't stop running until I was in the living room, panting and wide-eyed. I crashed down on the couch, my heart thumping in my chest, my mind racing. I couldn't sleep in my room that night. Couldn't even bring myself to go back upstairs. It was one of those moments that you try to convince yourself was just a weird dream or some trick of your mind. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't a dream, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been trying to tell me something. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, wide awake, too scared to sleep. For the next few nights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The house felt colder, even when the heater was on. I kept expecting to hear that whisper again, and every little noise made me jump. But it never happened. The silence felt even heavier, and the feeling of being watched never left. No whispers, no voices, just that deep, gnawing anxiety. We had a camera system installed when we moved in. It was a little old-fashioned, but it had cameras outside and around the back of the house. My dad liked knowing what was going on outside, and for a while, I didn't pay much attention to it, until I started noticing things. The back fence door would open on its own, even when it was locked. The locks weren't those heavy-duty ones. They were simple, the kind you just lift to open. And sure, it was possible that the wind could have blown it open, but every time I saw it, something about it unsettled me. It wasn't just the movement of the door. It was the way it seemed too deliberate, too smooth. The camera footage never showed anyone outside, but I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hear that damn door moving again. Every time I checked the footage, nothing. But I felt it. Something about that door opening felt wrong. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was the wind or the house settling, it never felt right. I got used to it, in a way. I learned to live with it, that gnawing feeling, that sense that something was always there, just out of sight, watching. Even when I was 18, 19, living in the house as an adult, it still had that weight to it. It wasn't like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, but it was always there, in the back of my mind. It was like the house had a history, a kind of heaviness that seeped into the walls. You could feel it if you paid attention long enough. And then there was the time I caught something on the cameras that I couldn't explain. It was late, maybe 1 a.m. I had just gotten back from hanging out with some friends and was going through the footage like I usually did, just out of habit. I was scrolling through the time-lapse, looking at the movement outside the house when I saw it. The back door, again, it was opening. But this time, it wasn't from the wind or some other natural cause. The footage showed the door pushing open slowly, smoothly, like someone had gently nudged it open from the inside. I froze. There was no sound, no movement in the footage after that. But I could see the door moving. I had no idea how long it had been open. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. But the door was wide open. I went to the back door immediately, and when I got there, I swear I could feel something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip through if they had been inside. The locks were still in place, the same as they'd always been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that yard. Something had been standing right there, just outside my reach. I locked the door, but it didn't help. That feeling stayed with me for days. It never went away, no matter how many times I locked that door. Eventually, I moved out of that house. It wasn't because of the weird happenings or the strange things I'd seen. It was just time to leave. I'd lived there for over a decade, and by the end of it, the house had started to feel too small, too oppressive. I was ready to go. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was always there, watching me from the shadows. I don't know what it was, or if it was just the history of the place getting under my skin. But whatever it was, I'll never forget how it felt. How it still feels, sometimes even years later. To this day, I can't go into a house with that same kind of layout, with glass walls and creaky floors, without feeling that weight, that pressure. It's not just the house that sticks with me. It's the feeling that something unseen is always just around the corner, waiting for the right moment to remind me that it's there. The day started like any other visit to my great-grandmother's house. I was 17, but I'd spent countless hours over the years helping her around her old house, a building that had seen more years than I had lived. Constance, my great-gran, had just turned 100. She couldn't walk, hardly left her bed, and was almost completely blind. But despite all that, she still had her sharp mind, filled with memories of a time long gone. She had lived in this house for over 60 years, and it felt like it was part of her, with every corner holding stories of its past. The house was an old schoolhouse, the kind you'd expect to find in the countryside, surrounded by overgrown gardens and a view of the river that could stop your breath. It was a 2-story building, white with peeling paint, a big porch that wrapped around the front, and windows that looked out over the river. From her bedroom, you could see the town in the distance, the river winding through the landscape like a long, lazy snake. Of course, Constance couldn't enjoy that view anymore. She was blind now. But I could still see it for her, in the quiet mornings when the sun caught the water just right. She spent most of her days telling me stories of children from the old school running around in the front garden, stories about men who had come into her house at night. But that's a different tale for another time. Most of the stories I didn't know what to believe, but they kept me coming back. One morning, I arrived early to check on her. She was resting in her bed, her frail figure barely visible under the blankets. I asked her if there was anything around the house that needed doing, something to keep me busy for the day. Her voice cracked as she told me to go check the garden. "Tidy it up a bit, love," she said softly. "You know how it gets out there." I headed out the front door, stepping onto the porch that creaked with every movement. The garden was overgrown, as usual, with weeds pushing through the cracks in the stone path and ivy creeping up the walls. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, the smell of wet earth and greenery filling my nose. I wasn't much of a gardener, but I didn't mind it today. As I walked around the side of the house, I noticed the narrow path next to the porch. It was hidden behind overgrown ferns and shrubs, a pathway I had never really paid much attention to before. It was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for one person to walk through, and it seemed to lead to nowhere. The branches above it blocked out most of the light, leaving the path dim and somewhat mysterious. I could see that it was covered in a thick layer of leaves that needed clearing, so I decided to get a rake and deal with it. I grabbed a rake from the shed and slipped on my gloves before heading back to the path. As I made my way down, I noticed that the path seemed to veer behind the house. It wasn't much of a path at all, really, but something about it felt off, like it was leading me somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The narrow space opened up into a small clearing, barely 5 by 5 feet, surrounded on 3 sides by the house and the embankment. I couldn't figure out how anyone could have built this tiny, strange little area. It didn't seem like a place anyone would have put effort into. The ground was uneven, and there was a feeling of neglect in the air. But then I saw it, a door tucked into the side of the house, almost hidden by the thick bracken that covered it. The bracken was so dense I had to push it aside just to get a glimpse. It was a small wooden door, darkened by age, and there was something written on it. Games Room, the word said, barely legible but clear enough for me to read. I stopped dead in my tracks. Games Room, I muttered to myself. This was the middle of nowhere, behind the house, in a small space I'd never noticed before. A games room? That didn't make any sense. I pulled more of the ferns away, my heart racing a little now. The door looked old, the wood warped with age, and a rusty padlock kept it shut. I tried it, but the padlock wouldn't budge. The metal was thick and sturdy, and no matter how much I tugged, it wouldn't give. My curiosity, however, was piqued. I noticed a small hole in the door, barely big enough to fit a finger through, so I pressed my phone's flashlight against it and peered inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. The door seemed to have another layer of wood behind it. It wasn't just an old locked door. It was as if someone had deliberately sealed it shut, and I couldn't figure out why. I stood there, staring at it for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease settle in my chest. I couldn't leave it alone. I needed to ask my great-gran about this door. Maybe there was some explanation, some long-forgotten memory she could share that would make sense of it all. I made my way back into the house, my mind racing with questions. I found Constance lying in her bed, looking as frail as ever. I showed her the photo I had taken, asking if she knew anything about the games room or the door in the back. She squinted at the photo, her hands trembling as she reached for it. But after a moment, she handed it back to me with a shrug. No love. The games room was down under the stairs, by the door. There were 2 rooms out back, but they were just storage. I don't remember there ever being a games room out back, she said, her voice distant. I stood there, feeling confused. If this was where the games room had been, why was there no memory of it? I asked her where the storage rooms were, trying to make sense of this strange discovery. She told me they were up on the embankment, built into the wall, and I immediately decided to check them out. The embankment was steep, and I had to scramble up the side of the house to get to it. The climb wasn't easy, but I made it to the top, my legs aching from the effort. And there, tucked away against the wall, were 2 wooden doors, similar in design to the door I had found earlier. These doors were even more weathered, the wood so old and cracked that it seemed ready to fall apart at the slightest touch. The locks were rusty, practically falling off. I pulled them open without much trouble, and inside was exactly what my great-gran had described, just old storage rooms. The floors were covered in rotting fabric and dust, and the air smelled stale. There was nothing of interest in there, just forgotten things. It didn't seem like anything special, but the fact that these rooms were tucked away, hidden from sight, only added to the strangeness of the entire situation. I asked my grandmother about these rooms, hoping for some kind of explanation, but she seemed uninterested. She barely reacted when I showed her the photos and asked her what she thought. Peculiar, she said, her voice cold and distant. Best go in and see Grandma, because we'll need to bring you home soon. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. These rooms, hidden away, sealed off from the world, made me uneasy. They didn't belong. They didn't make sense. Later that day, I asked my grandmother's daughter, Constance's daughter, if she knew anything about the rooms. She didn't. She had grown up in the house, but these rooms had never been part of her memory either. It was almost as if they had never existed. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't stop thinking about that tiny little space behind the house, the hidden door, the padlocked entry, and the fact that no one seemed to care or even remember it. It was like it didn't belong to this world. I thought about asking others in the town, but then I realized something that made my stomach drop. No one else had ever seen it. No one would have. That little path, that tiny space, was invisible to the rest of the world. The house sat on a hill, surrounded by trees and overgrown ivy, and nobody could see this hidden area from the outside. It was tucked away in such a way that it was completely detached from everything else. It was as if it existed in its own little world, completely separate from the rest of the house and the people who lived there. I don't know what the door was for. I don't know why it was there, why it was sealed, or why no one seemed to care. But I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't forget it. The mystery of that little space, that forgotten door, still lingers in my mind, and I can't help but wonder if there's more to it than just a random, old storage room. Maybe one day, someone will figure it out. But for now, it remains a strange, unexplained part of my great-grand's house, tucked away, hidden from the world. And maybe that's how it was always meant to be. I remember the summer I went back home to visit my parents while I was in college. It had been a while since I'd spent any real time in their house, so I was looking forward to catching up with them, even if it was just for a few days. I'd been working a part-time job during the week, so by the time the weekend rolled around, I was exhausted. It was about 11 a.m. when I decided to take a nap on the couch in the living room. The TV was on in the background, but I wasn't really paying attention. I just needed to rest my eyes for a bit. I must have dozed off for a while because I woke up feeling disoriented, not quite sure how much time had passed. The house was quiet, the light from the window shining down on the carpet. But then I heard it, a loud, distinct sound coming from upstairs. It was a doorknob rattling. Hard. It was the kind of sound you can't mistake, the jarring rattle of a door handle being shaken violently, as if someone was trying to get out. At first, I didn't think much of it. My dad was known for getting himself locked in rooms. It had happened before, usually followed by a string of frustrated muttering and a lot of banging on the door. This had to be him. I shook off the initial unease and got up from the couch, stretching my arms and walking upstairs to check on him. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The house was eerily still. All the doors upstairs were wide open. My dad wasn't anywhere to be seen, and there was no sign of anyone being locked in. I stood there for a moment, confused. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was still half asleep, and my mind had played a trick on me. I walked down the hall and peeked into each of the rooms. Each one was as I had left it. I checked the bathroom, the spare bedroom, the master bedroom. They were all empty, and nothing seemed out of place. No one had been locked in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I chalked it up to being tired. I told myself it was just my imagination playing games with me. I went back downstairs and turned off the TV. Maybe a little more sleep would clear my head, I thought. I curled up on the couch again, trying to ignore the lingering sense of unease. About an hour later, I was woken up again. The same sound, a doorknob rattling, only this time it was coming from the other side of the house, upstairs. I could tell by the sound that it wasn't close to where I had heard it earlier. This time, it was near the back rooms, farther away from the stairs, further down the hall. It was almost as if someone was walking through the house, trying to get into each room, one after the other. I groggily sat up, my heart starting to race a little. Was my dad upstairs again, having another mishap with the doors? It didn't make sense. I stood up and walked upstairs once more, my footsteps echoing through the quiet house. I went straight to the rooms at the back of the house. Again, all the doors were wide open. No one was in any of the rooms. I checked again, just to be sure. The bathroom door was open. The guest room door was open. There was no sign of anyone at all. I couldn't ignore the feeling in my chest anymore. Something was definitely off, but I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone in the house. I called my parents at work just to ask if they had been home earlier, or if maybe they had been up there and I hadn't noticed. Both of them said they hadn't been home at all. They'd been at their auto repair shop the whole morning, working on cars. That's when the cold feeling in my stomach deepened. The rattling of the doorknob wasn't just some odd sound. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been in the house, or at least in that part of it. But who? I didn't want to stick around to find out. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was starting to feel like the walls were closing in on me. I quickly grabbed my phone in my bag, trying not to freak out too much. I didn't want to overreact, but I had never been so sure of something in my life. Something wasn't right. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I left the house, locking the door behind me, and drove to a nearby coffee shop. I didn't care about the fact that I'd left my parents' house and wasn't sure what to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house. Not after what had just happened. I sat there for a while, trying to calm myself down and make sense of what I had experienced. But there was nothing that could explain it away. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. I didn't go back to my parents' house. The whole day, the rattling of that doorknob echoed in my mind. It was the kind of thing you try to forget, but it sticks with you, lingering like a bad dream. The next day, I decided to head back to my parents' house to see if anything had changed. I wasn't expecting any answers, but I had to check. When I got there, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet. No strange noises. No rattling doorknobs. I walked through the house, looking around, trying to make sense of what had happened. I kept coming back to one thing. The doors. They had been open when I checked. But why? Who could have been in the house? I eventually made my way up to the small room above the attached garage. My parents had been using it as a storage space, though it could have been a small bedroom. The room wasn't big, but it was tucked away from the rest of the house, a little out of sight. I was helping my parents move some things in when I saw something strange in the closet. There was a bookcase against the wall, but it wasn't just any bookcase. It looked out of place. It wasn't like the other furniture in the room. The wood was darker, older, and the shelves didn't quite line up the way they should have. I pulled it away from the wall, curious to see what was behind it. What I found made my stomach drop. Behind the bookcase, there was a doorway. Not just any doorway, but a small, hidden door that I hadn't noticed before. The door was set into the wall, leading to what looked like an attic space. It wasn't very big, just a cramped little area. But at that moment, standing there staring at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something I wasn't supposed to find. Something I wasn't meant to see. We eventually opened the door, more out of curiosity than anything else, and it just led to the attic. There was nothing up there. No old furniture. No creepy relics or remnants from the past. But the weirdness of it stuck with me. The whole situation, the rattling doorknobs, the empty rooms, the hidden door behind the bookcase, it all felt like a series of things that didn't quite add up. After that day, I didn't hear any more rattling doors. But I couldn't forget the feeling that something was off about that house. The strange noises, the open doors, and the hidden door behind the bookcase. It was like there was something being concealed. Something that wasn't meant to be uncovered. Even years later, I still think about it, and the feeling hasn't gone away. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it wasn't. I don't know for sure. But I'll never forget the way that house felt, and I'll never be able to shake the memory of those rattling doorknobs. I haven't been back to that house since. Every time I drive by, I feel a chill run down my spine. Whatever it was, it hasn't happened again. But I can't help but wonder if there's still something hidden in that house, something that was never meant to be discovered. It was one of those days where the air felt thick, the kind of day where time seems to slow down and everything feels off kilter, but you can't put your finger on why. The village was quiet, as usual, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Ireland. The roads were empty except for the occasional car or tractor passing by. I had met up with my friend that evening, and we had decided to take a walk, as we often did, through the old grounds behind the castle. The castle itself had always been an eerie place for me. Its stone walls stood tall, weathered by centuries of history, but still imposing. It had a sort of presence about it, something that felt like it was always watching, always waiting. But we didn't come out here to think about that. We came for the walk, for the quiet, and the escape from everything that wasn't rural Ireland. The castle grounds stretched for acres, with fields of grass and trees dotted here and there, and a few winding paths that led deeper into the forest. It was a peaceful spot, but that evening, something felt different. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was an edge to the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us, and the wind, which usually made a soft rustling through the leaves, was strangely still. We'd been walking for a while, just talking about random things, the type of things people talk about when they don't have anything pressing to say. My friend, ever the joker, was making fun of something, but I was distracted. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something move in the trees. It wasn't like me to get spooked, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. As we came to the end of our walk, the sun had long set. The path ahead of us was dim, but not yet fully dark. The old stone well that sat by the edge of the path caught my eye. I'd seen it hundreds of times before, but tonight it seemed different. There was something about it, something that made my skin prickle. I glanced back at my friend, but he had stayed a bit further behind, probably just messing with his phone or something, not paying attention like I was. I took a step closer to the well, squinting as I tried to make out whatever it was that had caught my attention. The well had always been a quiet place, just a simple old stone structure. It was surrounded by overgrown grass and wildflowers, but tonight, the shadows seemed deeper around it, almost like the darkness was swallowing the ground. I leaned in slightly, the curiosity pulling me forward, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light. But no, there were two yellow eyes staring up at me from the well. I froze for a second, my breath catching in my throat. They were unblinking, unnervingly still. My heart raced, a tight knot forming in my stomach. It felt wrong. It didn't belong. Then I saw the grin. It wasn't just a smile. It was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across a face that I couldn't make out, hidden beneath dark hair that seemed to hang in front of it, just barely catching the last bits of light. The yellow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't tear my gaze away, but then instinct took over, and I backed up, stumbling away from the well. "Hey!" I called out to my friend, though my voice felt small in the night. "We need to go. Now." He didn't hear me right away, and I glanced over my shoulder to make sure I hadn't imagined it, but the well was empty. There was nothing there, just the stone and the grass, and the creeping darkness swallowing everything else. I started moving back towards him, walking quickly, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping in. When I got to him, he looked up from his phone, slightly confused. "What's wrong?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "There's something in the well," I said, my voice tight. "I saw something." He laughed, probably thinking I was messing with him. But when he saw my face, he stopped. "What do you mean, something?" "A girl. I saw eyes. And a grin. Just trust me. We need to go." He stared at me for a moment, eyes narrowing. "You okay, man?" "I'm fine," I snapped, trying to sound more convincing than I felt. "Let's just leave." He shrugged and followed me, though he seemed hesitant. We walked in silence for a while, the feeling of being watched lingering in the air. It didn't feel right. The whole atmosphere around us seemed heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We made our way toward the old graveyard, a small, forgotten place tucked at the edge of the village. It wasn't far, just a short walk through the woods, but I wasn't feeling the usual calm I got from being out in nature. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the feeling became, like something was following us, lurking just beyond the trees. As we reached the graveyard, I saw her again. There, sitting on a tree near the edge of the cemetery, was the same girl. She was just sitting there, her legs dangling down, watching us. The same dark hair, the same eerie yellow eyes, the grin. I grabbed my friend's arm, pulling him toward the nearest gravestone. He was already looking in her direction, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he'd seen her too. We stayed there for a while, not speaking, just watching her. The longer we looked, the more unsettling it became. She didn't move. She just sat there, her head cocked slightly, like she was waiting for something. Waiting for us. I felt a sense of panic rising in my chest. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get away, but every step I took toward the exit of the graveyard felt like I was walking through molasses, like the ground beneath my feet had turned to mud. We left the graveyard quickly, our hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't say anything, but we both knew we were thinking the same thing. She was still following us. We walked in silence, heading for the bridge a few miles outside the village. The bridge was an old stone structure, spanning a small creek that trickled down from the hills. It was a place I had passed many times before, and it had always been peaceful. But tonight it felt different, like it was holding its breath, too. When we reached the bridge, I glanced across the expanse of stone, and there she was again, standing at the other end. She hadn't been there before. She was standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She hadn't been there before. She was standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. but I could see her face clearly enough. The yellow eyes, the grin. She started walking toward us, slow and steady, not running, but moving deliberately, like she had all the time in the world. I could feel my friend's grip tighten on my arm as he pulled me back. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. We stood there, rooted to the spot, as she drew closer. It was like we were frozen in place. And then, as suddenly as it had all started, the feeling of dread seemed to lift. The girl disappeared, as if she had never been there at all. 1 second, she was walking toward us, and the next there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the rustling of the trees. We didn't speak for a long time. We just walked in silence, the sense of unease still thick in the air. I kept expecting to turn around and see her again, but she never appeared. Later that night, as we sat in my room, trying to make sense of everything, I finally spoke up. "You saw her too, didn't you?" My friend nodded, his face pale. I thought I was losing my mind. I don't know what that was, but I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. We both knew what had happened, but neither of us could explain it. We had both seen the same thing, the same girl, the same eyes, the same grin. It didn't make sense, but we both knew it had been real. Maybe not in the way we wanted it to be, but real nonetheless. And that was the strangest part, the most unsettling part, that we had both seen it. The same thing, without any explanation, without any reason for it. We'd taken something that would alter our minds, sure, but the idea that we'd both hallucinated the same exact thing was enough to make me question everything. Maybe it was just the drug, maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, that night was one I would never forget. It was a cool fall evening, the kind where the air is crisp and sharp, the kind that makes you feel alive. My sister had come by to pick me up from my middle school, and we were heading to the theater to watch Scary Movie 3. We were both in a light-hearted mood, joking around and teasing each other about who was braver when it came to scary movies. She was always good at getting under my skin, and I was determined not to let her rattle me too much. It was the usual sibling banter, laughing at cheesy jump scares in the movie trailers, pretending we were tougher than we were. After the movie ended, we hopped back into her car. The laughter and the teasing picked up again. We drove through the neighborhood where I used to live, winding through the quiet streets, surrounded by the tall trees that lined the roads. It was late, probably close to midnight, but it was still a relaxing drive. The streetlights flickered here and there, casting long shadows on the ground. There was something oddly calming about it, despite the eerie stillness of the night. The conversation shifted to memories of our old house, the one we used to live in before my sister moved out. We both had some strange, uncomfortable memories about it. Things that never quite added up, things we tried not to think about too much. As we approached the house, I saw it in the distance, the same house that had been the backdrop for so many of our childhoods. It was one of those older homes, with large glass doors at the front that let you see straight into the living room from the street. The house had a certain charm to it, but there was always something a little off about it, something unsettling that neither of us could ever quite put our finger on. We were still joking, trying to scare each other with ridiculous stories and exaggerated claims. I was in the middle of some story about how I thought I saw something move in the bushes when suddenly, we both stopped talking. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The air around us felt suddenly heavier, thicker, and I noticed the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My sister didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see her tense up in the driver's seat. She turned to me with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" Goosebumps prickled across my skin, and a chill ran through my spine. I felt an icy tightness in my chest, like I couldn't breathe right. I didn't want to respond, didn't want to admit I had seen it too, but I could feel my body already betraying me, the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Tell me what you saw," I asked, trying to sound casual, but I couldn't shake the tension that had suddenly settled between us. I had to know if I had imagined it. She loved messing with me, and I wasn't sure if this was just another one of her pranks. But there was something in her eyes that made me think otherwise. She wasn't laughing, and neither was I. She took a slow breath, and her voice was quieter than usual. It was a man. He was standing inside the house, by the glass door. He had a long brown ponytail, and he was wearing a blue coat, like some kind of old-time soldier, maybe Revolutionary War or something. He was just standing there, looking out into the street, like he was waiting for something. She paused for a moment, as if trying to process the words that just left her mouth. It felt wrong, like he wasn't supposed to be there. The blood in my veins turned to ice, and the silence in the car was deafening. I couldn't even make myself respond at first. What she described was exactly what I had seen, down to the last detail. My heart started pounding in my chest, and my stomach flipped. The image of that pale man, standing motionless in the dark, staring out of the house, his eyes hidden in the shadows, but his presence still so strong, sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I had seen him too. There was no doubt about it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we were both seeing. My house was empty, no one was home. My parents were out doing who knows what, and no one was supposed to be there. I could hear my sister shift nervously in her seat beside me, her breathing a little heavier than before. "I'm not messing with you," I said, my voice shaking. I saw him too. For a moment, we just sat there, staring at the house. It felt like time had stopped. The car was idling, the engine purring softly, but the silence in the air was thick, oppressive. I wanted to reach over and shake my sister out of her trance, tell her we were being ridiculous, that it was just a trick of the light or something. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. Something wasn't right. "I think we should go around the block again," my sister said, her voice tense. "Let's see if he's still there." There was no arguing with that logic. We both needed to confirm what we had seen, needed to know if it was just our minds playing tricks on us. We turned the car around, driving slowly, deliberately, as we circled the block. The houses were dark, all the lights off, but my old house was still there, looming, its front yard empty, but for a few scattered leaves. When we pulled up again, we both scanned the front of the house. There was no sign of the man. No ponytail, no blue coat, no figure standing motionless by the glass doors. The house was quiet, too quiet. We both let out a sigh, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the absence of something. The fact that he had been there and was now gone made everything feel even stranger. "I don't know, I didn't like that," my sister muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just get out of here." I didn't argue. She drove me back to my new house, dropping me off with a promise to call and check in later. I could still feel the chill from the car ride hanging over me. It was hard to shake the unease, the strange feeling that something had been off that night. I don't remember exactly what I said to my parents when I told them what we saw. They just laughed, dismissing it as some kind of joke or overactive imagination. My dad chuckled and said, "You two are crazy. It was probably just a reflection or something." But I couldn't stop thinking about it, and neither could my sister. I couldn't shake the image of that man, pale, with that long ponytail, dressed like someone from another time. There was something so unnatural about him, the way he just stood there, staring out of the glass door as though waiting for something, or someone. After that night, I didn't want to go back to the house, and neither did my sister. She came by less and less, always making excuses when I asked her to visit. The house always gave her the creeps, she told me. Even when she was younger, it felt like something wasn't right there. As for my parents, they tried to dismiss everything. They didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that supernatural nonsense. They insisted there was a logical explanation for everything, but deep down, I could tell they were starting to wonder. My mom started talking about how strange some of the noises were late at night, and my dad even mentioned that things seemed to move around the house on their own. But they refused to admit anything was wrong, preferring to keep their heads down and ignore it. Eventually, we moved. My family packed up and left the house, and I never looked back. I don't know if the man we saw that night had anything to do with the house being haunted, but I've never been able to shake that feeling. My sister and I never talked about it again, but we both knew something wasn't right in that house. Even now, when I drive by the old neighborhood, I can't help but glance at that house, wondering if the pale man still stands in the dark waiting. But maybe that's just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe. It was early in my sophomore year of college, and things were moving fast. I was living in the dorms, getting used to the whirlwind of classes, hanging out with friends, and adjusting to the rhythm of college life. My girlfriend had come over to stay the night. It was a big deal for her first time staying in a guy's room. She'd stayed over at my place before, but this was different. We'd spent the night together, and she'd lost her virginity to me. It felt like one of those milestones that college relationships tend to have, but it was also a lot for her, and I didn't know it at the time, but it would come to feel like a turning point for both of us. That morning, I woke up early, and she was still half asleep, tangled up in the sheets beside me. I didn't want to disturb her, so I slipped out of bed and went into the bathroom to take a shower. I wasn't thinking about much when I turned on the water. I just needed to wake up and start my day. The water was hot, hitting my face and chest in that perfect way that always feels like a good way to start the day. But as I stood there, letting the water fall over me, something happened that I couldn't explain. At first, it was just a faint sound. I thought I had imagined it. It was like hearing a whisper, but I couldn't quite place where it was coming from. Then it came again, clearer this time. It was the sound of my name. It wasn't a soft call, though. It was loud. It was a shout. But it wasn't just any shout. It was like it was coming from far away. And yet, I felt like it was right next to my ear, like someone was whispering it into my brain. My name echoed in my head, but it wasn't the normal, everyday way you hear your name. It wasn't like hearing a voice calling from down the hall or in the next room. It felt deep, like it was inside me, like it was a scream trapped in my own head. "Jordan," the voice called. It wasn't my girlfriend's voice. At least, I didn't think it was. But it sounded panicked. It was frantic, desperate, like something was wrong, like something was happening. But I was in the shower, and the noise around me, the sound of the water hitting the tiles, made it hard to tell where it was coming from. I figured I was just imagining it. It wasn't the first time I'd heard a voice like that in white noise, and I was used to hearing things in the background that sounded like my name. It was one of those weird things that happens when your brain gets too used to hearing something. I tried to ignore it. I kept washing my hair, rubbing the shampoo in as if nothing had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. I tried to convince myself it was just the sound of the shower, the pipes, or maybe some outside noise echoing in a weird way. I convinced myself it was nothing. I finished my shower, dried off, and went about the rest of my day like nothing had happened. I never mentioned the voice to anyone. Not to my girlfriend, not to my friends, no one. I just pushed it out of my mind and kept going. It was the kind of thing I didn't want to think about, especially considering that I prided myself on being a pretty logical, science-oriented person. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I wasn't one for any of that supernatural stuff. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, a weird moment that wasn't worth mentioning. I wasn't going to get all caught up in some strange coincidence. 2 years later, my girlfriend and I were sitting in someone's dorm room, laughing and chatting with a group of people. The conversation turned to old stories, things we had done during college, things we remembered from the past. Someone mentioned staying at each other's places, and that led to some stories about the first time spending the night at someone's dorm room. And then, just like that, my girlfriend casually dropped a bombshell. "Oh, remember that first night I stayed at your dorm? You went to take a shower, and I got so freaked out. I had a panic attack, and I started screaming your name in my head. I don't even know why. At first, I didn't know what to say. I stared at her, my brain trying to catch up. My thoughts raced. Panic attack? Screaming my name? What was she talking about? We hadn't talked about that night much. I hadn't even mentioned the weird experience I had with hearing my name while in the shower. So why was she telling me this now? I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach turned. I didn't know how to process it. I asked her, "What do you mean, you screamed my name?" She looked confused, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I don't know. It was dark, and I was freaking out. I kept hearing your voice, but it wasn't like you were calling me from anywhere. It was in my head, like it was inside my brain. It scared me so much. I didn't know what was happening. It was like a voice screaming, 'Jordan, Jordan,' but it wasn't really you. I felt like the room was spinning. I couldn't think straight. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake it. The way she described it, it was exactly what I had experienced that morning in the shower. The voice, the panic, the strange feeling of something being inside your mind, deep inside you. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't say anything. I just sat there, staring at her, trying to figure out how she could have known exactly what had happened to me. It was impossible. We hadn't talked about it, and yet here she was, describing it in detail. Describing my exact experience, the exact feeling of hearing my name screamed from the depths of my mind. There were no answers. There were no ghosts, no angels, no supernatural forces. It wasn't something I could explain with science, and it wasn't something I could explain with logic. It was just something that didn't make sense, something that felt real but couldn't be real. My mind couldn't wrap around it, but I knew what I felt. I knew what I experienced. And now, I had this nagging feeling in my chest that maybe, just maybe, she had felt the same thing. The two of us sat there for a long time, both of us trying to process what had just been revealed. The conversation moved on, and I pretended to join in, but I was barely listening. All I could think about was that moment in the shower, the strange voice, the panic in her words. It was something neither of us could explain, and that made it even stranger. What did it mean? Was it a freak coincidence? Some kind of mind-bending parallel experience? I didn't know. As time went on, I tried to forget about it. It wasn't easy. The more I thought about it, the weirder it seemed. I kept wondering if there was something to it, if maybe there was something to the whole idea of minds connecting in strange ways that we didn't understand. But every time I thought about it, I came back to the same conclusion. There was no explanation. It wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. It wasn't something I could measure or prove. And yet, the thought lingered. It always did. Something inside me still couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a coincidence. It felt like a brush with something beyond the ordinary, something that didn't fit neatly into the world I knew. It was one of those things that would always leave me with more questions than answers. And I knew deep down that I would never quite be able to explain it, no matter how hard I tried. We never talked about it again, not really. It was one of those things that lived in the back of my mind, the kind of thing that made me question everything I believed about the world. But it was also the kind of thing that I couldn't bring myself to explore any further. Maybe I was too scared. Maybe it was better left unexplained. But I know this much. To this day, when I hear someone call my name, just a little too far off to reach, or when I'm alone and my mind starts to drift, I think back to that morning in the shower, and the strange, impossible feeling that we were somehow connected in a way that couldn't be explained. And I wonder, was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more to it, something we couldn't understand? It was 8 years ago, back when I was living with my ex and her 2 kids. I don't think I've ever fully gotten over that time, and not just because of the usual breakup stuff. There's something about the house, the atmosphere, that I still can't explain, even to this day. I remember this one specific time we were all sitting around the dinner table, eating, chatting, whatever. It felt like an average night. I wouldn't call it a particularly good night, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary either. That was until someone mentioned the dreams. I was in the middle of eating, probably poking at some chicken or something, when my ex's oldest kid, let's call her Emma, spoke up. She didn't speak much at dinner, usually busy with something else, but this time, she was looking up at all of us with wide eyes. "I keep having these weird dreams," she said, her voice kinda shaky. My ex looked up at her, concerned. "What kind of dreams?" Emma looked down at her plate, pushing food around like she didn't really know how to explain it. "Like nightmares. Really bad ones. Like I can't wake up." We all kind of stopped eating, and I could feel the room shift a bit. The whole table got quiet, like everyone was listening for the next words, waiting for the moment someone else would speak up. And then it came. One by one, all of us chimed in. The little one too, though she was too young to understand much of what was going on. But her voice still added to it, this shared understanding that something wasn't right. We were all having nightmares. And it wasn't just any nightmares. It was like they were real, like we were trapped in them, unable to wake up. I don't know why it took me so long to say anything. Maybe it was just the weird atmosphere or the dread hanging in the air. But I was a lucid dreamer. I've been that way since I was a kid. I can realize I'm in a dream, and I can either roll with it or I can bail. Sometimes it's fun. Flying, exploring, just doing whatever I want. Other times, though, the dreams get darker. They don't feel like dreams anymore. They feel like something else. This was one of those times. It was a couple of days later, and I went to bed that night, feeling that same unease, that feeling like something was off. The house itself felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I fell asleep like I always do, but then the dream hit. It started like any other dream. One minute, I was walking down the street near our place, and the next, it all changed. The world around me grew dim, the air thick with this suffocating weight, and I could feel something dark, was closing in. It felt like I was being watched, hunted. I couldn't see it at first, but I could feel it. That's when it stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't a demon in the way you see on TV or in movies. No horns, no fiery eyes. It was just wrong. It was a creature made of shadows, with an almost human shape, but its face was like an open wound, twisted and black. It grinned at me, and I could hear the low growl that came from its chest. It wasn't a natural sound. It was wrong. It felt like the kind of thing that wasn't meant to exist. I've never been one to just stand there and take it. I've always fought back when I'm aware I'm dreaming, but this was different. I wasn't just fighting something in my dream. I was fighting the dream itself. The demon in front of me was just the physical manifestation of whatever was controlling all of us. It was the nightmare given form. I don't know how I knew it, but in the moment, I just did. I could feel it, in my gut. The way out was an incantation. A chant. Words that would break the dream, banish it. I didn't understand them. I didn't even know what I was saying, but the moment they left my mouth, I felt this power surge through me. It was like something clicked. The demon stopped in its tracks, recoiling from the sound of my voice. It didn't like it. It wasn't used to being confronted like that. But I knew in that moment, I wasn't just speaking in the dream. I knew I was saying these words out loud in the real world too. I woke up in the middle of the night with a jolt, my body still tense from the dream. My ex, who had been sleeping next to me, was staring at me wide-eyed. I remember the feeling of her gaze, even though I was barely awake. She said something, but it took me a second to process it. "Armor Phoenix, you're talking in your sleep." I didn't even know what I had said, but I knew I'd been saying something important. Maybe it was the adrenaline from the dream, or maybe it was the fact that I was still half dreaming, but I couldn't help myself. I turned to her and said the first thing that came to mind. "I know." She looked at me, eyes wide, still not sure whether she should be scared or just confused. She asked me, "Why?" Without thinking, I responded with the words that made the most sense in the moment, like I had some kind of deep knowledge I wasn't even aware of. Because spells are more powerful when you say them out loud. And with that, I rolled over and went back to sleep, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, everything felt different. It wasn't just the usual foggy morning after a weird dream. It was like the air had lifted. The house, which had felt thick with anxiety and dread, was lighter. I didn't realize it at the time, but that conversation in the middle of the night had cleared something. It had broken whatever was causing the nightmares. My ex told me the next day that what I had said in my sleep didn't sound like any language she knew. It wasn't English, but it also wasn't complete gibberish. It was like there was a rhythm to it, something ancient but still understandable. She was freaked out, but in a way, she was relieved too. It felt like it worked. After that night, the nightmares stopped. Not just for me, but for everyone. Emma stopped waking up screaming. The little one didn't toss and turn as much. Even my ex, who had been so scared, slept through the night without any interruptions. It was like whatever had been plaguing us was gone. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know why I knew what I was saying or why it worked. It could have been the power of suggestion, the way our minds trick ourselves. But for the first time in weeks, we slept peacefully. We woke up feeling normal, like we had shaken off something that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. We never talked about it again. Not really. I didn't want to bring it up because I couldn't explain it, and I don't think anyone else could either. But whatever happened, it worked. And the house, well, it was like the curse was lifted. I still remember that night, though. The dream, the fight, the words. I can't help but wonder if the whole thing was a coincidence, or if I really did stop something that night. Maybe it was all just in my head, but sometimes, when I look back at that time, I'm not so sure. All I know is that after that, no one in the house had another bad dream. Not one. Maybe it was just luck, or maybe it was something else entirely. But it felt real, like we'd all passed through some kind of test and come out the other side. And to this day, I can still remember those words I spoke in the dream, even though I didn't know what they meant. I've never had another nightmare since. Not like that. And I guess I'll never really know why. Freshman year at university was supposed to be a time for new beginnings, a time to meet new people and experience new things. I had a roommate I barely knew, a schedule full of classes I didn't really understand yet, and the usual nervousness of being away from home. But something about the campus made me feel like I was always on edge, like there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The old dorm building near the edge of the campus had always stood out to me. Everyone talked about it in hushed tones, like they were afraid to even say its name. The place was notorious for being the spot everyone avoided. Nobody lived in it, and the windows were always dark, like the building itself was holding its breath. I hadn't thought much about it until one night, a few months into the semester, when I was walking around campus with my friend Matt. He'd been in a bad mood all day, still reeling from a breakup with his girlfriend. We were walking aimlessly, mostly just to get out of the dorms, trying to clear his head. I wasn't sure how to help him, but I thought maybe talking about something else could get his mind off things. I brought up the old dorm, mostly out of curiosity, mentioning the rumors about it being haunted. He wasn't really in the mood for ghost stories, but I figured it might distract him for a little while. The stories had been circulating since the time I got to the campus. 2 women had died in the building on separate occasions. One had been murdered, the other had committed suicide. The locals and some of the older students swore that the place was haunted by their spirits. Everyone claimed they could feel it when they passed by, the kind of cold, uncomfortable feeling you get when you know you're being watched, even if no one's there. We found ourselves standing by the old building, just outside the tall iron fence that ran along the perimeter. There was an eerie stillness about it, the kind that made the air feel too thick, almost like it was pressing in on you. We stared at the windows, seeing nothing but dark, empty spaces. I started telling Matt about the rumors, describing the 2 women and their tragic fates. As I was talking, we noticed the hallway lights flickering inside, though I didn't think much of it. Old buildings tend to have electrical issues, right? But still, there was something about the whole thing that felt off. The way the bottom floor of the building was laid out, you could look through one of the windows and see all the way down the long hallway. The building was narrow and stretched for what felt like forever, with 2 doors on each side, and the hallway running straight down the center. You could see the other door at the far end, like a portal to another world. We walked up to one of the windows, leaning against the wall as I continued to talk. I guess I thought that if I kept going, it might make Matt feel better. But then, just as I was about to say something else, we both stopped, almost in unison. 2 girls walked out of one of the rooms at the far end of the hall. They didn't make any noise, didn't say a word to each other, just stood there, side by side, looking at nothing. They were wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in the 70s or 80s, big, thick sweaters, faded jeans, the kind of outfits you'd see in old photos. It didn't make sense, considering this place had been abandoned for years. We weren't sure if we were seeing things, but the longer we stared, the more real it became. I nudged Matt, whispering, "Do you see that?" He nodded slowly, his face pale as he kept his eyes locked on the 2 figures. The girls just stood there, silently, staring at each other. And then one of them, without warning, slowly turned her head and looked directly at us. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She didn't blink, didn't even seem to flinch. She just looked straight at us, eyes vacant and distant, like she could see right through us. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned her head back to her friend and calmly walked away. The other girl followed suit, both of them disappearing around the corner, out of sight. I don't know why, but I had an immediate, gut-wrenching feeling that something wasn't right. Matt and I stared at each other, both of us wide-eyed. Without saying a word, we turned and ran to the other side of the building, hoping to find another way in or out. We checked both doors, but the hallway was empty. There was no sign of anyone. But as we stood there, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen, we heard it. The same 2 girls, walking down the hall. The same clothes, the same movements, the same eerie silence. They were back. We didn't even think twice. We bolted, running back the way we came, our footsteps echoing in the empty night. We didn't stop until we were safely back near the dorms. Neither of us said anything for a while. We just stood there, breathing heavily, not quite believing what we'd just witnessed. It felt too real to be a trick of the light, too vivid for us to just shrug it off. I tried to sleep that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes, locked onto mine, like they were searching for something. As I lay in bed, trying to block out the images, I heard a sound. A crash. My posters, every single one, fell off the wall at the same time. I sat up, heart racing, the room suddenly cold. I couldn't explain it. There was no breeze, no open windows. Everything had been secure. But there they were, scattered across the floor, like they'd been pulled down by some invisible force. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I told another friend of mine, Jake, what had happened. I wasn't sure if he'd believe me, but he seemed interested, almost too interested. He insisted we go back to the old dorm to see for ourselves. I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but part of me was curious, the other part just wanted closure. I knew I couldn't get it out of my head unless I faced it again. We made our way to the back of the building, where we found an open window. Jake's eyes lit up, and I could see the excitement in them. I was hesitant, but before I could protest, he was already inside. I followed him in cautiously. The room we climbed into was small and bare, just a few pieces of old furniture left behind. There was a strange smell in the air, like damp wood, and something else I couldn't place. We started walking down the hall, trying to stick to the walls and stay as quiet as possible. The place felt even more oppressive now, like the walls were closing in around us. We walked past the rooms, each one just as empty as the last. But something started happening. A water faucet turned on in one of the rooms, the sound of running water echoing through the hall. We looked at each other, confused. Maybe someone had left it on before leaving? But as we moved forward, we noticed more faucets turning on. First one, then another. And then, as we passed a room and came back, the chair that had been sitting in the corner was now moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough to make me feel like we weren't alone. Then, when we got to the first floor, we saw something that made my stomach drop. A desk, completely flipped upside down, sitting under the stairs. It wasn't there when we passed earlier. It had been moved. I didn't say anything to Jake, but I could tell he was starting to get nervous too. The air felt heavier, and the further we walked, the more things seemed to change. A picture frame, once standing, was now lying face down on the floor. A door that had been slightly ajar was now wide open. We started to feel like we needed to leave, but as we made our way back toward the window to climb out, the sound of running water grew louder. The faucets in the rooms were all on now, and the noise was overwhelming. It sounded like every faucet in the building was running at full blast. I tried to ignore the growing sense of panic, but I could feel my pulse quicken. Something was wrong. When we got to the window, ready to climb back out, the door slammed shut. It was so sudden, so forceful, that I almost stumbled back. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but the door was locked, stuck. My heart was racing now, and I could hear the sound of water rushing, louder and louder, as if it were coming from every direction. I don't know how we managed it, but in that moment, adrenaline kicked in. We pulled the door open with all the strength we had, dove through the window, and ran without looking back. My lungs burned as I sprinted back to the dorm, my legs shaky from the rush of fear. We never went back. Neither of us ever spoke of it again. But that night stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind for the rest of my time at the university. No matter how many times I walked past that old building, I could never shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting. It was one of those regular nights at my grandmother's house when everything felt calm, even a little too calm. I was in high school at the time, still staying at my grandparents' place for the weekend. My grandmother, who usually stayed up late on her computer, was in the living room like she always was. The house was quiet, aside from the occasional click of her keyboard and the soft murmur of her low music playing in the background. I remember hearing her footsteps moving through the house, a rhythmic sound that was nothing out of the ordinary. She was always up at odd hours, but this night, the sound of her footsteps felt different. They were heavier somehow, like they had more purpose behind them. She had been so absorbed in whatever she was doing on the computer, but I didn't think much of it. After all, she was always at the computer late into the night, so I figured she was just getting up for something. But then something happened. She called out to me, or at least I thought she did. She turned around in her chair, and I heard her speak, clearly expecting me to be standing right behind her. "What's up, Katza69?" she said. At first, I didn't think much of it. My grandmother had this way of calling me that, a nickname she'd given me years ago that was a mix of my name and a random word she had found amusing. But when I didn't respond right away, she must have realized something wasn't right. She turned fully in her chair, and that's when I heard her gasp. It was a sharp, sudden intake of breath, the kind that rattles your bones. I wasn't there. I hadn't been there at all. I was in the other room, just laying on the couch, scrolling through my phone. It made me feel uneasy, as if the air in the room had suddenly turned colder. I remember hearing her mutter something under her breath, but I didn't catch the words. I didn't think much of it until later that night. I was in the shower when I noticed something strange. The glass shower door was fogged up from the steam, but it was still partially clear. I was just about to rinse off the shampoo from my hair when I saw something. I didn't want to look at first, but I couldn't help it. There, through the misted glass, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. The thing that caught my attention wasn't the shape of it. It was the eyes. They were black, empty, hollow. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, then raced. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just seeing things, but when I opened them again, she was still there. The girl was standing, just on the other side of the glass, watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, like the air had gotten thicker. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I blinked again, and she was gone. But even now, I can't forget her eyes. Those black, hollow eyes. After that, I didn't sleep much. Every little sound, every creak in the house made me jump. It felt like something was always just around the corner, waiting. The next day, I told my friend about what had happened, thinking maybe it was just some weird freak thing. But she told me something that made my blood run cold. She had seen the same girl. It wasn't just me or my grandmother. It was real, and it was happening to everyone. She had been in the basement, in the fridge, grabbing some water. The basement was always a little creepy, even though there was nothing really unusual about it. The house was old, sure, but nothing had ever made it feel off, until that night. She told me that while she was in the fridge, she saw something standing at the top of the basement stairs, just standing there, unmoving. At first, she thought it was me, or maybe one of the kids, but then she realized it wasn't. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring. She said the eyes were what scared her most. They were black, completely black, like empty sockets in a face. There was no expression, no movement, just those eyes. She couldn't make out much else because the basement was dimly lit, but the way she described it sent a shiver down my spine. The girl had the same black, hollow eyes. My friend didn't tell me much more. She didn't need to. I could see the fear in her eyes. She was scared, just like I was. It wasn't long after that when my grandmother had the dream. At first, she didn't say anything. But one evening, while we were sitting in the kitchen, she casually mentioned something that made the hair on my neck stand up. She told me that she had dreamt about the girl. But in the dream, there was no girl. Instead, there was a well. A deep, old well, right in the middle of our backyard. In the dream, it wasn't our house. It was a different time, a different place. There was no house where ours stood, just land stretching out as far as the eye could see. In the dream, she could feel everything, the anxiety, the sorrow, the hopelessness. It was so real to her, like she was actually there. She said that in the dream, the girl had fallen into the well, and something about it felt tragic. Something had happened to her. Something had gone wrong, and my grandmother felt all of it. She said it was as if she was reliving that moment, feeling the emotions of the girl who had died in that well. It was heavy. My grandmother woke up in a cold sweat, her chest tight from the suffocating weight of the dream. I didn't know what to make of it, but I could tell she was rattled. A few weeks later, something strange happened while I was in the backyard. It was a normal day, sunny, with the wind rustling through the trees. I was out back near the garden, and as I turned around to head back inside, I noticed something. A depression in the ground, something out of place. It was a small area, just big enough to be a hole, but not deep. I brushed it off, thinking it was just some spot in the earth that had settled over time. But then, I remembered my grandmother's dream. I grabbed a shovel and dug at the spot. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but it felt like I had to. The dirt was soft, easier to dig than I expected. I kept going deeper and deeper until I hit something hard. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I cleared more dirt away. What I found didn't make any sense. There, buried under the dirt, was a small stone, roughly shaped. It looked old, worn by time, but still there, hidden beneath the earth. It wasn't just a random rock. It had a strange symbol carved into it. I didn't know what it meant. It didn't feel right, though, like it had been waiting there for me to find it. I buried it back, unsure what I should have done with it. I just couldn't bring myself to leave it there exposed. But after that, the feeling of something lurking in the house, watching us, never went away. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something far more unsettling, a presence that we couldn't explain. It was real. It was something that couldn't be ignored. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe it was just an odd sequence of events. But after everything that happened, after everything I saw and heard, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was like there was something about that girl, something about her that had been tied to the house long before we ever moved in. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or spirits, but I can't deny that something happened in that house. Something real, something that left its mark. I don't know if it was the girl's energy, or if it was just some kind of strange coincidence. But it's been years since then, and every now and then, I think back to that house. I think back to that girl with the hollow black eyes. I never saw her again, but the memory of her watching, standing just out of reach, still haunts me to this day. Maybe it was just an unsettling chapter in my life, something my mind created. Or maybe there was something else in that house that we couldn't understand. I don't know. But whatever it was enough to make me wonder what really lurks in the shadows, just beyond what we can see. We had always thought it was a joke. We'd all messed around with the Ouija board before, usually at one of our houses, just to get a reaction from each other or try to spook our girlfriends. Nothing ever happened, so we didn't really believe in it. It was always more about the thrill of pretending that something weird might happen, just to get a scare out of each other. But this time was different. That night, things went way beyond what any of us had expected. It was a Friday night in the fall of our senior year, and there were 7 of us at my friend Matt's place. It was the usual crew: me, Matt, my best friend Rob, his girlfriend Emily, Matt's girlfriend Sarah, and 2 of the other guys from school, Kyle and Jason. Matt's house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by farmland and woods. His parents were gone for the weekend, so we had the place to ourselves. The house was old, creaky, and had that eerie feeling, especially when it was dark outside, and there was no one around but us. We figured it would be the perfect place to mess around with the Ouija board again, even though we'd done it a dozen times before. We pulled the board out of the closet, where it had been gathering dust. I think it was Sarah who had brought it over that night. She was the one who hadn't done it before. She'd been curious, but skeptical, just like the rest of us. We were all around the living room, sitting on the floor in a circle. The lights were dim, the TV off, and the room smelled faintly of stale air and dust, the kind of smell you only get in old houses. I don't know why, but the atmosphere felt different this time, a little heavier. Maybe it was just the excitement or nervous energy in the air, but it felt odd. We placed our fingers on the planchette, the little heart-shaped piece of plastic that was supposed to move when we asked the board questions. Matt was the one to start, like he always did. We all gathered around, our hands touching the planchette, none of us really taking it seriously. We started with the usual questions, stupid stuff like, "Is anyone here?" and "Are you a good spirit?" just to get the ball rolling. At first, nothing happened. No movement, no energy. Just like every other time we'd tried it. We were all laughing and joking about how dumb it was, but Sarah seemed a little more serious this time. "Let's try it for real," she said, her voice more quiet than usual. "I want to see if it really works." We all nodded, kind of humoring her. Matt asked the first real question. "Who's here with us?" The planchette moved. Slowly, but definitely. The rest of us fell silent, watching as it glided across the board, coming to a stop at the letter H. Then it moved again, this time to E, and then to L. "Hell," Kyle scoffed. "What, we've got a Hellraiser here or something?" We all laughed again, but Sarah looked a little pale. "Try asking it more specific questions," she suggested. We all agreed and started asking more detailed questions. Who was the spirit? Where were they from? But the answers were strange. The board seemed to respond with more accuracy than we expected. It spelled out things none of us had ever heard about our town. It told us about an old building that had once stood where the farm now was, a building that burned down in the 1800s. None of us had ever heard about that before, but it seemed specific, like it knew something we didn't. As the questions kept coming, the board started to reveal more. It claimed to be a 10-year-old boy named Thomas. He said he had died in an accident on the property sometime in the 1800s. His story was so detailed, almost as if he was really there, speaking to us from the past. He said he'd been playing near the barn when he got caught in the machinery, and that his family never marked his grave because they were too poor to afford a proper burial. That last part hit me hard. The idea that this kid might be speaking the truth was unsettling, especially since Matt's family had lived on the farm for generations. What if the board was telling the truth? What if there really was something buried out there? We were all uneasy now, but still skeptical. We thought maybe one of us was moving the planchette, trying to mess with the rest of us. Then Rob, trying to prove a point, asked, "Okay, if you're really here, prove it. Knock on something. Show us that you're real." The planchette moved again, but instead of spelling out anything, it just stopped. The room went dead silent. We all stared at the board, waiting for something to happen. And then it came. The sound was unmistakable. Rap, rap, rap. It was a sharp, deliberate knock, coming from the window right next to us. I can still hear it in my head now, even though it's been years. It was as though someone was outside, knocking on the glass to get our attention. But when we all turned toward the window, there was no one there. The lights outside were on, casting long shadows against the porch, but there was no figure, no one standing outside. We checked the yard immediately, and no one was around. The knock hadn't come from anywhere inside the house either. It came from the window, and the sound was crystal clear, like a tap you'd give a door frame. But there was no explanation. We froze. No one moved, and no one spoke. My heart was pounding in my chest. We all stared at the window, then at each other, all of us trying to figure out what had just happened. But none of us could come up with an explanation. We were too scared to even look at the board again. "I'm done," Matt muttered, his voice shaky. "This is messed up." None of us wanted to touch the board after that. No one moved. No one said a word. We just sat there in the darkness, the only sound in the room being our shallow breathing and the occasional creak of the old house. I don't think I've ever felt so on edge in my life. It was like something had shifted in the room. The air felt heavier, and the silence was deafening. "Let's get out of here," Rob said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was the first to stand up. We all followed, none of us wanting to be the last one to leave the room. We moved in a group, like we were being watched. The weird thing was, none of us wanted to leave the house. It felt like something was waiting for us outside, like we couldn't escape whatever had just happened. We all ended up outside, standing in the yard, staring at the house. The porch light flickered on and off, casting long shadows on the ground. It felt like the house itself was watching us, like the boards had somehow connected to something else, something darker than we'd ever expected. "I'm never doing that again," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I don't care if it was a joke or not. That was real." No one disagreed. We all agreed that whatever we had just experienced was no joke. It wasn't funny, and it wasn't something we could brush off. But we also couldn't explain it. We couldn't explain the knock, and we couldn't explain the answers the board had given us. The spirit, the boy, it all seemed too real. And from that night on, we never touched that Ouija board again. The board stayed at Matt's house, untouched, gathering more dust. We didn't talk about it much after that. It felt like we had opened a door we shouldn't have, and none of us were brave enough to go back and see what was on the other side. The whole thing just hung there unspoken. The worst part, I still wonder if that kid's grave is out there somewhere, buried in the ground, hidden by time. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or spirits, but that night, it changed something. We were never the same after that. We never messed around with the supernatural again. Because whatever we had done that night, whatever we had opened, we couldn't close it. And for all we knew, something was still out there, watching. The first time I saw the box, I didn't think anything of it. It was just a large, rectangular parcel, plain and brown, sitting on our front step. The kind of box you might expect to receive from an online order, or, in this case, something a little more important. My father's cousin, Rachel, was getting married, and my mother was going to be altering her wedding dress. That was why the box had come, sent directly from the bridal store to our house. I remember my mom picking it up off the porch, muttering something about how it didn't look like the most well-handled package she'd ever seen. It wasn't so much the shape or size that was odd, it was the condition. The cardboard was slightly bent at the edges, like it had been dropped or dragged, and there were visible creases running down the sides. Some parts of the box were crushed in, and the tape holding it together was peeling off in spots, as if someone had hastily wrapped it up. But nothing was broken, and it was addressed properly, so she just shrugged it off. She had a lot on her plate, with the wedding preparations, and didn't think too much of it either. Days passed, and I went about my usual routine, trying not to think about the dress. It wasn't mine, after all, and I had my own things to focus on. But one afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, talking with my great-aunt, who was visiting for a few days. I don't remember how the conversation started, but she brought up the wedding dress. "Did you see that box it came in?" she asked, her tone oddly hesitant, like she was trying to keep the conversation light. I remember thinking it was strange that she'd ask, but then again, she was a little quirky, so I didn't think too much of it. "Yeah," I said. I remember it wasn't in the best condition when it came. Mom said it looked like it had been through a lot during shipping. My great aunt turned to look at me, and for a split second, there was this look in her eyes, like she was unsure whether she should continue. Then she just nodded and quickly changed the subject, asking about something else, but the way she acted lingered with me. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Maybe it was just one of those oddities that you notice, but don't make much of. But it stayed with me, and I kept thinking about how she reacted. Why had she seemed so uncomfortable talking about it? And why had she asked me, of all people, about the box? Later that night, after dinner, my parents came to talk to me. They both looked serious, and I could tell something was off. "Your great aunt called," my mother said, sitting down across from me. Her voice was quiet, like she didn't want anyone else to overhear. "She mentioned that you two were talking about the wedding dress box. She said you told her that it came here, that you and I had talked about it." My stomach sank. "Yeah, we did talk about it. You remember, right? The box was on the porch, and you said it looked like it had been dropped or something." My mother's face hardened, and she looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "No, I don't remember any conversation like that. The box never came here. I don't even know what box you're talking about. Are you sure you're not confusing it with something else?" I felt a jolt in my chest. "No, Mom, I'm not confusing anything. The box came, I saw it, and we talked about it. You said," I paused, trying to remember the details. "You said it looked damaged, and we both agreed it must have been mishandled during shipping." My mother's face stayed the same, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," she repeated. "The box never came here. Maybe you're just remembering it wrong. Your great aunt must have misunderstood you." I felt my heart race, a tightness in my chest. This wasn't right. I knew what had happened. I knew that conversation happened. It wasn't a mistake. But the more I tried to explain it, the more frustrated I became. It was like I was hitting a wall, and no matter how hard I tried, nothing would make sense to them. I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I had never felt so alone in my own memory before. "No, it happened, Mom. It really did. I was there, and we talked about it. You saw the box, I swear you did." My father, who had been silent until then, looked at me with an uncomfortable expression. "Listen, kiddo, I don't know what's going on, but your mom's right. There was no box here, and there was no conversation. Maybe you've just confused the details." I felt like I was going crazy. Why didn't anyone else remember it? Why was I the only one who seemed to be holding on to this memory? It felt like my grip on reality was slipping, and it scared me more than anything. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, my mind replaying the conversation with my great aunt over and over again. I could still see the box clearly in my mind. I could see the way the light from the window hit the cardboard, the shadows it cast on the carpet. I could hear my mother's voice, the way she had spoken about the condition of the box. But no matter how hard I tried to bring it up again, no one would acknowledge it. They acted like I was making it all up. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My mother acted like nothing had happened. She didn't mention the wedding dress or the box again. But I couldn't forget it, no matter how hard I tried. I wanted to move on, to forget that conversation, but every time I thought about it, the frustration built up inside me again. Weeks passed, and I tried to let it go. I really did. But something about it still gnawed at me, like a loose thread that couldn't be tied up. I couldn't stop thinking about how real it felt. I kept asking myself, had I imagined the whole thing? Or was there something else going on? Something that no one was willing to talk about? Then one afternoon, my great aunt called me again. This time, it wasn't about the wedding dress or the box. She asked how I was doing, how the wedding was coming along. But I could hear the hesitance in her voice, like she was holding back something. I couldn't resist anymore. I had to ask her, "Hey, about that box. You remember talking about it with me, don't you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost reluctant. "I remember," she said quietly. "But it's not what you think." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on?" She sighed. "Look, I didn't want to get into it, but the box, it wasn't just a regular shipping box. It wasn't something your mom would have just forgotten. But there are things we don't talk about, things that happened a long time ago. And I think it's better if you just let it go. Some memories are best left alone." I didn't know what she meant by that, but something in her voice made me feel like I wasn't just imagining things. It wasn't about the box or the dress. There was something deeper, something that no one was willing to explain. I never brought it up again. I didn't press her for answers, because I could tell it wasn't something anyone wanted to revisit. But in the back of my mind, I still wonder. Was it a glitch in my memory? A mistake? Or was there something else, something no one was ready to face? To this day, I stand by what I remember. The box came, it was damaged, and my mother and I talked about it. No one else remembers it, but I'll never forget. The way the light hit the cardboard, the creases on the sides. I'll never forget it. It happened, and I know it did. The sun was setting as I stood at the back door of my mom's house, staring at the garage a mere 6 feet away. I had just finished a long day of errands, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening. My boyfriend was coming over soon, and I thought I'd grab a couple of drinks from the fridge in the garage while I waited. It was a routine I'd done 100 times before. The garage wasn't connected to the house, which made the walk there feel a little isolated, but nothing unusual about it. It was a small, old structure with a rusted metal door that creaked when it opened. I didn't think much of it. As I stepped out of the door and onto the cracked concrete path that led to the garage, I felt a sudden gust of wind that sent a chill down my spine. The air was thick and humid, but something about it felt off. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the weather. The sky was still light, though the sun was fading, and I noticed the trees rustling in the distance. I had just made it a few steps down the path when something odd happened. A loud, shrill chirp broke the silence. Before I could react, I felt a sharp pain on my scalp, followed by frantic flapping above me. Something was attacking my head, flapping its wings wildly, almost like it was trying to latch onto me. I screamed and swatted at the air, but it wouldn't stop. I turned around, heart racing, and bolted back toward the house as fast as I could. My feet pounded against the ground, and I could hear the bird's wings flapping just behind me, like it was chasing me. The pain on my head was sharp, and I felt a rush of panic flood through me. I made it back to the door and slammed it shut, gasping for breath, hands trembling. I leaned against the door, trying to calm my nerves, but the terror didn't let up. The bird didn't stop. It hovered outside the window next to the back door, chirping relentlessly. Its beady eyes stared at me through the glass. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. I didn't know what to make of it. The bird was aggressive, and the way it looked at me made me feel like I had done something wrong. I had no idea why it had attacked me in the first place. I pulled the curtains closed, but I could still hear its piercing calls, echoing in the quiet of the evening. My pulse was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was not just a random encounter with an angry bird. Birds don't behave like that. They don't chase people. I tried to tell myself it was all just some strange fluke, but it didn't feel like that. It felt too deliberate, too strange. I grabbed my phone and texted my boyfriend, telling him what happened. I didn't want him to be worried, but the truth was I was scared. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I was starting to feel a sense of unease that went beyond just the bird. The fact that it was still there, hovering outside the window, staring at me through the glass, made everything worse. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to gather the courage to go outside, but every time I opened the door, the bird would start its flurry of wing beats, its high-pitched chirps ringing in my ears. It was as if the bird knew I was afraid of it, and it was enjoying the power it had over me. I couldn't figure out what it wanted, or why it was acting so hostile. I texted my boyfriend again, asking him to hurry up, to please come over as soon as possible. I needed someone else there, someone to make sense of what was going on. But as the minutes dragged on, I felt more and more trapped. The bird wouldn't leave. It stayed perched on the windowsill, staring at me with an unblinking gaze, its chirps growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was in full-on panic mode. I was pacing the house, trying to think of a way to get the bird to leave. It wasn't like I could just wait it out. It seemed like it wasn't going anywhere. I started looking around the kitchen for something I could use to defend myself. A broom? A stick? Nothing seemed like it would work. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, I had an idea. My mom had a heavy old frying pan hanging on the wall above the stove, the kind with a thick, iron handle. I grabbed it, feeling its weight in my hand as I crept toward the door. Slowly, I cracked it open, ready to swing at the bird if it came anywhere near me. But when I stepped outside, the bird wasn't immediately in sight. It was perched on the edge of the roof, looking down at me, its head tilted to one side as if it was studying me. I took a deep breath and, with a quick motion, swung the pan upward, hoping to startle it. The bird flinched, and for a split second, I thought I'd hit it, but it didn't fly away. Instead, it squawked in fury and dove at me again, its wings flapping furiously. In a panic, I swung the pan again, this time hitting it with a dull thud. The bird tumbled to the ground, stunned but not dead. It flapped weakly, its wings catching the ground in a violent spasm. It seemed dazed, confused. For a moment, I thought it was going to get up and attack me again, but instead, it just lay there on the ground, gasping for breath. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to hurt it, but I also didn't want it to keep terrorizing me. After a long, tense moment, the bird finally stopped moving. I wasn't sure if it was dead or just knocked out, but I didn't stick around to find out. I went back inside and locked the door, not daring to look out the window. I was too shaken up. My boyfriend finally arrived not long after, and I told him everything. He didn't know what to make of it either, but he did his best to comfort me. The bird didn't return, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I had gotten too close to its nest, or if it had just been a freak accident. I couldn't explain it. But then, something even weirder happened. A few days later, my parents and I were sitting in the living room, randomly looking out the window. I'm not sure why we were staring out there. Maybe it was just a slow afternoon, or maybe we were trying to spot a deer or something. But as we watched, we saw our neighbor pull up to her house. She got out of the car, and as she did, a bird suddenly flew up and landed on her arm, as if it had been waiting for her. It was the same kind of bird that had attacked me days earlier. It looked the same, small, brown, with a sharp, beady eye, and it perched on her arm like it was perfectly natural. We all watched in silence, and it felt off. There was something strange about it, something that felt connected to what had happened to me. At the time, we all just shook it off as coincidence, but a few days later, my mom called me while I was with my boyfriend on the 4th of July. Her voice sounded odd, almost distant. She told me that our neighbor's husband had died in a car accident. The cause? A bird had flown in his car window while he was driving, and he had lost control of the vehicle. He had crashed and died on impact. I was speechless. The accident had happened a few years ago, but hearing the details hit me hard. I couldn't shake the eerie connection between the bird that attacked me, the bird that had landed on our neighbor's arm, and the tragic accident that had claimed her husband's life. It didn't feel like just a series of coincidences anymore. It felt like some strange, twisted chain of events that no one could explain. My parents were still shaken up by the news, and honestly, so was I. Every time we saw a bird after that, we all felt a chill down our spines. It was as if the events were somehow tied together, even though I couldn't make sense of it. The idea of a bird being responsible for a death, no matter how strange, seemed impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that life doesn't always make sense. Sometimes things just happen, and sometimes those things are too weird, too unsettling to ignore. To this day, I can't help but feel uneasy whenever I see a bird, especially when they seem to stare at me. The memory of that day in the yard, the frantic flapping, the bird's piercing gaze, it still lingers. I don't know if it's all connected, but part of me wonders if there's more to the story than we'll ever understand. All I know is, I'll never look at birds the same way again. It was about a year after we had moved into the house when my daughter first started asking about the smoking. I had been a smoker for years, more than half my life, really. At that time, I smoked about a pack a day, though I made a conscious effort to keep my habit away from my daughter. I smoked only outside or in the basement, away from the main areas of the house. I wasn't stupid enough to smoke around her, especially in her room. She had always been a sensitive kid, and I had learned quickly that certain things bothered her more than they bothered most kids. So, when she asked me that first time, I thought she might just be confused or imagining things. "Mom," she said one evening after I tucked her in, "why do you smoke in my room at night?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I tried to keep my voice calm. "I don't smoke in your room, honey," I told her gently. "I never smoke upstairs." She gave me a long, steady look, her small face creased with the kind of intensity only a 7-year-old can muster. "But someone does. They sit on my bed, and I smell it. It smells like your cigarettes." I shook my head, even though I wasn't entirely sure why. The thought of someone sneaking into the house in the middle of the night, sitting on her bed, and smoking in her room was, well, it was a thought that didn't sit right with me. It felt off, like a bad dream I couldn't quite wake up from. I told her again, as gently as I could, that it wasn't me, and that she must have been dreaming, or maybe it was a smell from somewhere else. She seemed satisfied with that, but she still brought it up a few more times in the days that followed. It was hard to brush it off after hearing it so many times. My daughter was adamant about it. She'd describe it like she knew exactly what it was. Someone sitting by her bed, the smell of cigarettes, a feeling of someone just there. But I couldn't make sense of it. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, a small town where people generally respected each other's privacy. I had no reason to believe that anyone would come in during the night and sit on my daughter's bed. It just didn't add up. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't completely shake the uneasy feeling that had started creeping in at the back of my mind. Things came to a head a couple of weeks later, during a parent-teacher conference. I didn't expect much. It was the usual routine, discussing grades, social behavior, how she was settling into the new school. But then, out of nowhere, her teacher pulled me aside. "I'm not sure if you'll believe this," she said. She looked a little uncomfortable, as though she was preparing to say something she wasn't sure she should. "But your daughter mentioned something that's been bothering me a little." She paused, as though she was measuring her words carefully. "She told me that someone is sitting on her bed at night and smoking. She says it smells like cigarette smoke, and she swears it's not you." At that moment, I felt the room tilt for a second. My stomach twisted, and I suddenly wasn't sure how to respond. The teacher must have seen the look on my face because she quickly added, "I don't want to offend you, but I think I should tell you about something. It might sound strange, but it's important." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could speak. She continued, "The house, right? It used to belong to my in-laws. They moved away a few years ago. And well, I think I know who your daughter might be talking about." My heart raced, and I had to swallow hard to stop myself from saying something panicked or ridiculous. "What do you mean?" She hesitated again. "My mother-in-law, she wasn't allowed to smoke because of her health. But she used to sneak into the house late at night when no one was around and have a quick cigarette. She liked to sit on the bed in the room that's now your daughter's. She'd sit by the window, smoke, and just relax for a bit. It was her secret spot, I guess you could say. She passed away a while ago." My mind spun for a moment, trying to wrap itself around what I was hearing. I hadn't known about any of this. In fact, I didn't know much about the previous owners of the house at all. We'd gotten the house from the teacher's in-laws through a mutual connection when we moved to town. I had never been told anything about their personal lives, their habits, or the fact that they had a family member who used to sneak in and smoke in what was now my daughter's bedroom. The teacher was still talking, but I wasn't really hearing her anymore. I was thinking about what she had just said. My daughter had been so insistent. She had described exactly what this woman used to do, sitting by the window, on the bed, smoking at night. And somehow it made sense. It was the one thing that fit perfectly with everything my daughter had been describing. "I don't want you to think I'm suggesting anything," the teacher continued, "but your daughter might be picking up on something from the past, something tied to the house. Maybe the smell of the cigarettes. Maybe it's her way of connecting to someone who used to be there. She's a sensitive kid. I know it sounds strange, but that's what I think is happening." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't know what to believe anymore. It didn't sound like a joke, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't something my daughter was just making up. She had been so sure of herself every time she'd mentioned it. The rest of the conference passed in a blur. I could barely focus on what else the teacher was saying. My mind kept going back to the idea that someone had been sneaking into the house to smoke. Someone my daughter had never met, but was somehow still aware of. I didn't tell my daughter what I'd learned from her teacher. I didn't want to freak her out more than she already was. I simply promised her that I'd look into it, and that was the end of it for that night. But it wasn't the end for me. For weeks after that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood outside my daughter's bedroom door just listening. For hours. I tried to hear the soft, familiar sound of cigarette smoke drifting in through the cracks. I tried to catch the faintest scent of it lingering in the room. But there was nothing. It was silent. No one was sneaking in. No one was smoking in her room. But that didn't stop my daughter from asking again and again. Every couple of nights, she would ask, "Why is someone smoking in my room, Mom? Why won't they stop?" I knew she was serious, and I knew it wasn't something she was just making up. So one night, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I stood by the window in her room and had a long conversation in my head with whoever had been smoking in that room. I talked to them the way you might talk to a stray animal or a noisy neighbor. I asked them to respect my daughter's space and to stop coming in and smoking while she was asleep. It was hard to do, but I somehow felt that it was the right thing to try. I didn't know if it would make any difference, but I had to try something. It felt like the only way forward. After that, something shifted. My daughter didn't ask about the smoking anymore. The strange, unsettling presence that had lingered seemed to dissipate. It wasn't something I could explain or point to, but the air in that room felt different. It felt like it had finally been cleared, both literally and metaphorically. And from that night on, there were no more questions about smoke. No more talk of someone sitting on her bed. No more insisting that it was happening while I wasn't around. I'd like to say that I fixed everything with that talk, but I don't think it was that simple. I think it was more about respect. Respect for a space, for boundaries, and for the past that had somehow bled into our lives. The house didn't feel haunted after that. It felt like ours. My daughter's room stayed quiet and peaceful, and though I still couldn't explain it, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been there before, whatever had left the smell of cigarettes lingering in the air, had found its way to a place where it no longer interfered with us. In the end, I guess some things are just better left in the past. I've worked as an assistant in nursing for a while now, and while the job can be challenging, there's a certain kind of comfort in the routine. I'm a pretty big guy, so I tend to get assigned to what we call the companion cares, which basically means I'm the one who stays with patients who need constant supervision. These patients are often confused, agitated, or even aggressive, especially if they've been under anesthesia or have serious medical conditions that mess with their mental state. It's a role that requires a lot of patience, but it's also one I've grown to be quite good at. I can calm people down just by listening to them, staying calm myself, and reminding them what's real and what's not. The night in question started like any other. I was coming on shift and getting my handover. My colleague told me about the patient I'd be looking after, a man who had been through some pretty intense anesthesia the night before. Apparently, the drugs had made him lose it a bit, causing him to be disoriented and anxious. Last night, he had been in a real state, talking about things that weren't there, and he'd even tried to get out of bed to search for things that didn't exist. So, as I entered the room, I was mentally prepared for anything. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his hands moving restlessly under the sheets. His eyes locked onto mine when I walked in, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. But then, as if he'd just remembered something, he turned his head towards me, his eyes wide with what I can only describe as terror. "There's something on the wall," he whispered, his voice trembling. I had heard it all before. The anesthesia messes with the mind, and patients often see things that aren't real. I had dealt with it hundreds of times. I took a deep breath and sat down beside his bed, keeping my voice calm and reassuring. "Don't worry, mate," I said. "You're still coming out of the anesthesia. Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. There's nothing on the wall." But he wasn't convinced. His eyes were fixed on the wall across from him, and he was pointing at it now. No, there's something crawling up it. Can't you see it?" I didn't want to outright dismiss him, but I had learned over time that the best way to deal with these situations was to acknowledge what they were experiencing and then guide them back to reality. I looked over at the wall, but it was just a standard hospital room wall. Nothing unusual. I smiled gently and nodded. "It's just the medication, I promise. There's nothing there, but I'll prove it to you." I stood up and walked over to the wall. Slowly, I ran my hand along its surface, gliding my fingers from one end to the other. I made sure to cover every inch, not wanting to leave any doubt in his mind. My hand felt the smoothness of the paint and the texture of the drywall beneath, and everything seemed normal. "There," I said, turning to face him. "There's nothing on the wall. See, all clear." But then, just as I finished speaking, I felt it. It was subtle at first, almost like a faint tingling on the back of my hand. But it didn't stop there. As I moved my hand along the wall, I could feel it again, a brief, almost imperceptible sensation, like something brushing against my skin. It was a cold feeling, like a tiny, invisible insect crawling along my hand. My heart skipped a beat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, trying not to react. I didn't want to make the situation worse. So, I kept my face neutral and didn't let any fear show. "There's nothing there," I said again, trying to keep my voice steady. though I couldn't quite shake the chill that ran down my spine. "You're still seeing things, mate. It's just the medication." I turned to him, trying to give him a reassuring smile, but his face had gone pale. His eyes were wide, and he was looking at me like I had just told him the worst news of his life. No, it's still there," he insisted, his voice trembling. "I can see it. It's moving up the wall. Can't you see it? Right there." I knew he wasn't making it up. The man wasn't a liar. His mind was just playing tricks on him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sensation on my hand had been real, even if it didn't make sense. Still, I pushed it aside. I had to stay calm. I had to be the one to reassure him. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice soothing. "I'll go back. Let's check again, all right? But I'm telling you, there's nothing there." I walked back to the spot on the wall where I had felt the strange sensation. My fingers hovered over the surface of the drywall, and I slowly started to trace the same path I had just taken. The air around me felt heavier now, and I was hyper-aware of every little sound. The beeping of the machines in the room, the soft rustling of the patient's sheets as he shifted restlessly, the quiet hum of the overhead lights. Everything seemed amplified. And then, just as I reached the spot where I had felt the strange brushing sensation earlier, it happened again. I felt it. It was like something had just brushed against the back of my hand, the same cold, crawly sensation. My heart raced, and I nearly pulled my hand back in reflex, but I kept my composure. I couldn't let the patient see that I was freaked out. I had to keep up the act. But I felt that same horrible, shivery feeling creeping over me. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just in the patient's head. I turned to him and tried to keep my voice steady, but there was a tremor in it that I couldn't suppress. "See, there's nothing there. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. I promise." But his eyes were wide with panic, and he was pointing again, his fingers shaking violently. "There, right there. Can't you see it? It's crawling right up the wall, right in front of you." I tried to control the rising panic in my chest, but inside I was screaming. I didn't want to show it. I couldn't. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that spot on the wall, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me too. But I had to stay calm. I had to stay in control. Finally, I stepped back, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The patient was still looking at the wall, his face twisted in fear, but I had to remind myself that it was the medication. He was seeing things. It wasn't real. There was no way anything could be crawling up that wall. "You're just seeing things," I repeated. "It's okay. You're all right." But the words felt hollow, even to me. I didn't believe them anymore. Something was wrong, and I didn't know what it was. I stayed with the patient for the rest of the shift, trying my best to keep him calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was crawling around in that room, something that I couldn't see, but that was real in some way I couldn't understand. When my shift finally ended, I handed over to the next nurse and left the room as quickly as I could. I didn't say anything about what had happened. It seemed like the kind of thing that would only make things worse if I mentioned it to anyone. Over the next few days, I tried to put the experience out of my mind. I had seen enough strange things in the hospital to know that people's perceptions can be skewed by medications, by stress, by trauma. But every time I passed that room, I couldn't help but glance at the wall, wondering if the sensation I'd felt on my hand had been real, or if it had just been my imagination. The truth is, I still don't know what happened that night. I never will. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget the feeling of something crawling up that wall, even if it wasn't there. And sometimes, the strangest things stay with you long after the shift ends. When I was around 8 years old, we moved into this massive old house on a street lined with even older mansions. It was the kind of street that looked like it had been frozen in time. Those huge, stately homes with heavy, dark wooden doors, big windows that seemed too high up to ever reach, and overgrown hedges that made the place feel both magnificent and a little unsettling. Some of the houses were beautiful in their own way, but they had something strange about them. Like one house on our street that was completely covered in gargoyle statues. There were dozens of them, perched on the roof, sitting by the front door, looming from the sides of the house. They were creepy, but somehow impressive too. Then there was the house next door. I'm not sure who lived there, but they had these life-sized ceramic cow statues in their yard, painted in all these weird colors, pink, orange, and covered in this bold, almost garish paisley and argyle design. It looked like something out of an artist's wild imagination. They were beautiful in a bizarre way, but every time I passed by, I felt an odd chill run up my spine. The whole street had an eerie vibe to it, but the house we were moving into, that place, it had something else. We were shown the house by the owner, a middle-aged man with a quiet demeanor, and I remember him having his young son with him, a little boy, maybe 4 years old. The moment we finished touring the house and were about to leave, the kid started screaming. Like, not just crying, but full-on terrified screaming. We rushed to him, and he was standing in the bathroom, staring at the wall, his face pale and his body frozen, like he'd seen something that just shut him down. It wasn't until we got close that he even moved or spoke. He just kept pointing at the wall and shaking. My mom and the man tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. It was bizarre. At the time, we just brushed it off as some weird kid thing. He was probably tired or overstimulated from the tour. Red flag number 1, though, if we'd known better. When we moved in, that's when things started to get weird. First off, we kept getting locked out. Every single time we tried to unlock the door, the key wouldn't turn. No matter how many times we tried, we couldn't get in. It wasn't like the door was jammed or anything. The key simply wouldn't work. We'd have to call a locksmith, this older Chinese man, and he'd show up and fix the lock, but he said something that stuck with my mom. He told her, "The ghost of the house doesn't know you yet, doesn't like you." We all kind of laughed it off at the time, but I remember my mom looking uncomfortable after he left. She didn't say anything to us then, but later, she told us she felt like there was something in the house that wasn't happy we were there. That feeling lingered in the air, but we didn't think much of it. Time passed, and we settled in, but things got stranger the longer we stayed. The house was beautiful in its own way. Huge, with lots of rooms, grand wooden staircases, and high ceilings that made it feel almost like a palace. But there was something off about it. You could hear things late at night, doors opening and closing when no one was around. The fridge or the freezer door would open and close by itself, sometimes multiple times in a row. It was like someone, or something, was messing with us. My mom's boyfriend, who would often babysit us when she worked nights, refused to leave her bedroom after hearing strange noises. He said he could hear a woman's voice talking, but he was too scared to check it out. He'd sit there in the bedroom, frozen, just hoping it would stop. It never was her, of course, but he wouldn't dare go downstairs to see what it was. There was one thing that really stood out to my mom, though. She had an electrician come over one day to fix something in the house. Something to do with the wiring, I think. The electrician had to go down into the basement to check the electrical box. I didn't even know the house had a basement at the time. I didn't even know the house had a basement at all until that day. The basement was where the servants' quarters used to be. It had this weird, forgotten feeling about it, like it hadn't been touched in decades. There were old lockers and beds still down there, left behind by whoever had lived there before. And in the middle of it all was a sealed-off well. My mom said she and the electrician both got a strange chill when they saw it. There was something unsettling about that basement, and she didn't like going down there. But the worst of it came one night. My mom came home from work late, and her boyfriend was jogging up the stairs. She called out to him, telling him to be careful and not run up the marble stairs, because the bottom floor and stairs were all made of polished marble, and they were slippery. But as she said that, she suddenly got this horrible chill. She turned around, and standing in front of her, at the top of the stairs, was a woman. The woman's face was all twisted and mangled. Her jaw was hanging off, broken in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It looked like she had fallen down the stairs and died like that. My mom was frozen in place. She was terrified. She told her boyfriend to look, but he refused. He ran out of the room and wouldn't even look back. My mom said it was one of the most horrifying things she had ever seen. The image of that woman, hanging by her broken jaw, haunted her for days. But there was more. We had been living in the house for almost a year when the final straw came. My mom and her boyfriend were packing up the last of our stuff to move out, and as they were getting ready to leave, the door slammed shut. They couldn't get out. They tried to unlock the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut. That was when they called the locksmith again. When he came, he took one look at the door and said, "Ah, she doesn't want you to leave now." The locksmith seemed like he was used to this kind of thing. He didn't even seem that surprised. But my mom was freaked out. She wasn't scared anymore, though. She had just had enough. So we left. It wasn't until later that my mom sat us down and told us everything that had happened at that house. everything she had seen and heard. It was clear to her now that it wasn't just the weird kid's reaction or the strange noises. There was something in that house. Something that didn't want us there, but something that had grown attached to us over time. We moved out, and that was the last we saw of that house. To this day, I haven't seen anyone else move in. The owner still pops by every once in a while, and every time I drive past, I wonder about that place. The gargoyle house and the weird cows across the street, I still think about them sometimes. I drive by the street, and it's like it's frozen in time, with nothing changing, and that one house still standing dark and empty. I don't know if I'll ever know the full story of what happened there, but I know one thing for sure. That house was never truly empty. It was always full of something else, something we couldn't quite understand. And it seems that, whatever that was, it didn't want us to leave. We left, and I'm glad we did. It was only after we were gone that my mom was able to truly understand what we had all been living with, even if we didn't see it at the time. We had all been living with something dark and unseen, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. The house where I grew up is a massive 3-story structure, tucked away in a quiet corner of a small town. It's the kind of house that you can't help but notice when you drive by, its tall windows stretching from floor to ceiling, the chimney curling up into the sky like something straight out of an old book. The layout is odd, the rooms all twist and turn in strange ways. There's a cellar that we never really went into much, except for storing old boxes, or sometimes when my brother, who's a musician, would bring his keyboard down there to practice. The house had a way of making sounds, ones that seemed to echo throughout every floor. The floors were thin, creaky, and the walls were no help either. Everything that happened on one floor could be heard all the way across the house. It wasn't unusual to hear voices from upstairs or someone walking around late at night. But there was one sound, that happened more than once that I never could quite figure out. It started years ago, one morning when I was home alone. I woke up early, not quite morning yet, but the kind of early where it's still dark outside. I heard my brother playing the piano, the unmistakable sound of his fingers brushing the keys, the same songs he always played. He would sing along, his voice loud and slightly off-key, but it didn't matter because that was just how he was. The sound of him singing echoed through the house, traveling from the basement up to the second floor, where I was. Without thinking, I yelled down the stairwell, "Shut up, you're being so loud." It was a natural response. He could get pretty obnoxious sometimes. But then I paused. My brother wasn't home. He had gone out with my parents early that morning, and it hit me all at once. He wasn't in the basement. He hadn't been there at all. I stood there, frozen for a moment, listening. The music stopped. It was like someone had just turned it off. I couldn't hear anything anymore. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that maybe it was just the wind, maybe the sound was traveling from somewhere else. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to feel uneasy. I went down into the basement anyway, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. It was dark down there, as always. The light in the stairwell flickered a little as I walked down the narrow stairs. The basement smelled musty, and the air was cool, as though the house was trying to hold on to some chill that didn't belong. When I reached the bottom, I flipped the switch and looked around. The piano was still there, its keys slightly yellowed with age, but nothing else was out of place. No one had been there, and yet I could still hear my brother's voice, still feel the echo of his singing in my head. It didn't make sense. Over time, I managed to push it out of my mind. I figured maybe it was just a trick of sound, some strange acoustics in the house. The basement had a way of making noises carry, and maybe I had been half asleep when I heard it. But even then, there was always that lingering feeling, the idea that something wasn't quite right. Fast forward to this past week. My brother and I were back at the house for the holidays, and I didn't expect anything to happen again. But of course it did. The layout of the house had always been strange. The basement stairwell led into a small corridor, and off that corridor were 3 rooms: the bathroom, the laundry room, and the rec room. The rec room was the one with the piano, where my brother had spent so many hours as a teenager. I had been in there countless times, watching him play and listening to his music. It was a room full of memories for both of us. This time, I was in the shower, with the bathroom door left slightly open. It was just a habit, I guess. I had always left it like that. I could hear everything from the bathroom, and sometimes it felt like the house was breathing along with me. It's hard to explain. but there was a certain quiet hum that seemed to fill the space. As I brushed my teeth, I heard the music again. It started faintly at first, a few notes from the piano in the rec room. It was the same tune my brother always played, the one he would sing along to. It was so familiar that for a moment, I didn't think twice. But then, the music grew louder, and I heard his voice, clear as day. He was singing along, just like he always did. For a brief moment, I was content to let it go, to believe that maybe my brother had gotten back without me noticing. But then I remembered that he hadn't been upstairs when I came out of the shower. The music was coming from the rec room, the same place where I had just left my brother's piano. There was no way he could have gotten past me without me hearing him, without seeing him. My mind raced as I turned off the bathroom light and walked toward the hallway. I peeked into the rec room. It was empty. The piano was still there, untouched, and there was no sign of my brother. But the sound of the music was still there. It was faint now, as if it had been turned off or faded into the air. I checked every room in the basement, walked through the dark laundry room, and stood by the bathroom door, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing. The house was silent again, just the way it should be. I walked back upstairs, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. When I entered the kitchen, my brother was standing there, eating a sandwich. I asked him, "Hey, have you been in the basement today?" He looked at me like I was crazy. "No," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Why?" I told him what had happened, about hearing him play and sing in the rec room, but he insisted that he hadn't been downstairs at all. There was no way he could have snuck past me without me noticing. But when I asked him again, he was adamant. He hadn't been near the basement all day. At that point, my heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. I went back down to the basement, checked the rec room again, and looked around. It was exactly the same as it had been before. The piano sat there, undisturbed, and everything seemed perfectly normal. There was no reason for me to feel so unsettled, but the feeling didn't go away. Over the next few days, the same thing happened. The music would play, and I would hear my brother's voice, but he was never there. Each time, I would go down to the basement, and it would be empty. No one was there. Nothing was out of place. But the music kept coming, like a voice calling out from somewhere just beyond the walls. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. It wasn't possible. My brother hadn't been in the basement. There was no way sound could travel like that, could mimic his voice so perfectly. But it did. It kept happening. And each time, the music felt more real, more grounded in the space, like it was meant to be there. The more it happened, the more I realized something. Maybe it wasn't my brother's voice at all. Maybe it was something else, something that was lingering in that house, something that had always been there but never shown itself before. Maybe the house itself had a way of trapping sound, of carrying memories, of holding on to the past. I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if it was something else entirely, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The last time it happened, I was sitting in the living room, trying to read a book. I had been avoiding the basement, avoiding the rec room. I didn't want to hear the music again, didn't want to face whatever it was. But then, from the far end of the house, I heard it again. The faint sound of piano keys. And then the voice. This time, I didn't go down to check. I didn't want to. I couldn't. I sat there, staring at the book in my lap, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. The music continued, soft and clear, and the voice was there, always just out of reach, like it was meant to haunt me. It was my brother's voice, unmistakable, but I knew it wasn't him. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. I don't know if anyone else would even believe me. But every time I hear that music, I can't help but wonder if the house knows something we don't. If it's holding on to something that shouldn't be there. Something that isn't supposed to be forgotten. The music stopped eventually, but the feeling didn't. It stayed with me. And now, whenever I'm in that house, I listen for it. I wait to hear it again. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who can explain away the things that seem too strange or unexplainable. I tend to look for logical answers, and I've always been able to find one. That's what makes this story so unsettling for me, because try as I might, I can't figure out what happened during that trip. I was 11 years old, just a kid in a big group of classmates, heading off to a summer camp for a few days. It wasn't the kind of camp with counselors leading activities like arts and crafts or kayaking. This place felt more like a survival camp. It wasn't fancy, and honestly, It didn't look like something out of a brochure. The buildings were old, the cabins smelled of damp wood, and the whole area had a kind of oppressive stillness to it. The trees surrounding the camp were thick, towering overhead, and everything felt more isolated than it should have been. I don't even remember the name of the camp, but I'll never forget the atmosphere there. From the moment we arrived, something felt off. The other kids were just as uneasy as I was, and we hadn't even unpacked yet. There were lots of kids complaining about wanting to go home, and it was more than just a few crying fits or homesick whines. It was like we all knew something wasn't right, but none of us could put it into words. The whole camp felt wrong, like it was somehow pushing against us, making it hard to breathe. The first night, things really started to get weird. We were all supposed to be settling into our cabins, trying to get some rest after a long day of hiking and setting up. I was lying in my bed, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into the night. There was the occasional creak of the cabin, the rustling of trees outside, and the far-off chatter of other cabins. But then, as I was trying to sleep, I heard it, a tapping on the window. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from a branch or the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Tap, 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 tap. The sound wasn't random. It had a pattern to it, almost like someone was standing outside the window, tapping with their fingers, tapping at a steady pace, as if they were waiting for something or someone. At first, I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. I froze. It was impossible to ignore now. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The sound was too specific, too structured. I didn't want to believe it, but it didn't feel like anything natural. My heart started to race as I lay there in the dark, listening to it continue, like a ticking clock counting down. What the hell was it? I sat up in bed, my breathing shallow. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the dark outline of the woods beyond. It was too dark to make anything out, but I was sure someone was there, someone standing just out of sight, tapping on the glass. I don't know why, but I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to tell someone. I bolted out of bed and ran into the nook where our counselor slept. I shook him awake, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. But the clock next to him read 3 a.m, and he didn't seem to care. He grumbled and told me to go back to bed, that it was probably just the wind or some animal outside. I wasn't convinced. Something in me told me that this wasn't just a coincidence. I left him there, still half asleep, and went back to my bed. The tapping had stopped, but the air felt thicker now, like something was just waiting for me to turn off the light and close my eyes. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, but it was never truly quiet. I kept waiting for the tapping to start again, and sure enough, just as I was starting to drift off, it came back. Tulp. Tap tap. Tap tap tap. Tap tap. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there in my bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the rhythmic tapping. It was as if the sound had locked me in place, paralyzed by my own fear. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually it stopped. And when it did, I couldn't bring myself to fall asleep. My eyes stayed wide open, and I kept listening for the sound to come back. The next morning, everything felt off. It wasn't just me. The whole group seemed out of sorts. It was like a collective fog had settled over the camp. It wasn't like the usual first-day exhaustion, where everyone is tired and cranky. No, this was different. It was as if something had happened to us overnight that we couldn't explain. Kids were unusually quiet. A few were still crying, and there was a general sense of unease that lingered in the air. I didn't want to talk to anyone about what had happened the night before. I didn't want to sound crazy. And besides, when I asked around, nobody else had heard anything. Everyone else had been asleep, and no one had heard any tapping or anything strange at all. They all just thought I had imagined it. But I knew what I heard. I could still feel the vibrations of that tapping in my bones. The next day, we were supposed to go canoeing on the lake, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I kept imagining the boat tipping over, the water swallowing me whole. I refused to get in the boat, even when the counselor tried to convince me. My head was spinning with the thought of drowning, even though I wasn't a weak swimmer. It didn't make any sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something would happen to me if I went on that water. I wasn't the only one acting strange. There was something about the woods that kept pulling at me, calling me. It wasn't like a curiosity. It wasn't like I wanted to explore. No, it was more like an overwhelming compulsion to walk into those woods, to get deeper into them. My feet itched to move, but my mind screamed at me to stay away. I didn't understand it. I didn't want to understand it. But it felt like the woods were beckoning me, like something there had an interest in me. And the fear, it wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was different. It was a deep, primal fear, the kind that makes you feel like you're standing on the edge of something that you can't control. It wasn't like normal kid fears of monsters under the bed. No, this was existential. I was 11, but I felt like I was suddenly aware of my own mortality. Like the possibility of death was no longer a far-off thing, but something right in front of me, something real and tangible. I couldn't get rid of the feeling. It lingered through the whole trip. Even on the bus ride back home, I couldn't shake the thought that something bad was going to happen to the bus. I kept scanning the road ahead, convinced that something would jump out of the trees, that we'd crash, or that something worse was waiting for us. When I got home, I tried to talk to my parents about it, but they just brushed it off. They told me it was normal to feel that way after being away from home for a few days. But I knew it wasn't just normal. There was something else, something more intense, something I couldn't explain. It was as if I had seen or felt something that my brain couldn't process, and it stuck with me long after I left the camp. I talked to the other kids who were there. I asked if they'd heard anything, or if they felt anything strange, but everyone else seemed to have forgotten about the tapping and the weird feelings. They said they didn't remember anything odd happening at night. They hadn't felt anything unusual, but I knew what I heard, and I couldn't forget it. The rhythmic tapping on the window, the feeling of being watched, the compulsion to walk into the woods, it all stayed with me long after the trip ended. I couldn't find a rational explanation for it, and that's what scared me the most. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was something natural, a weird animal, or a person playing a prank, but I can't help but feel that there was something more to it. I've tried to reason it out, tried to tell myself that it wasn't as bad as it felt, but deep down, I know there was something wrong with that place, something I couldn't put into words. Maybe it was just a bad feeling, a trick of the mind, or maybe there was something in those woods. But whatever it was, it left a mark on me. Even now, I don't know what to make of it. I can only trust the fact that I know what I heard and what I felt. But beyond that, I'll never know for sure. The house I grew up in was old, really old. It was a big Victorian house, the kind you'd see in a movie, with narrow hallways, creaky floors, and too many rooms for its own good. My dad had bought the place years ago, when I was still pretty young. He saw potential in it, something I never really understood. Maybe it was the way the house looked in the dim light, its high ceilings and ancient charm. He loved to renovate, to fix things up, to make it into something new while still holding on to its history. And over the years, he worked on it obsessively, slowly turning it into a home. But no matter how many walls he tore down or how many floors he polished, there was always something about that house that made me feel uneasy. The attic was the worst. I could feel it even when I wasn't up there, an odd, oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me. It was huge, like a full third story, with an old wooden floor that creaked under the slightest movement. There were old beams running across the ceiling, thick ones that looked like they could have held up the whole house, but they also gave the place a sort of dark, uncomfortable atmosphere. My older brother had always been braver than me, and while he spent time up there in his own corner of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. Every time I walked by the stairs leading up to the attic, I'd feel this knot in my stomach, a strange tension in the air. My feet would move faster, and my heart would start to beat a little harder, like the house itself was watching me. When I was about 13, after my brother left for college, my dad decided to finish up the attic. He said it was going to be a great space for me, a whole apartment to myself. So he renovated it. He put in 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, and a little living space. He was excited about it, but I wasn't. Every time I stepped into that new space, it still felt the same. It didn't matter that the walls were freshly painted or that the floors were now sleek and modern. The house still carried that same eerie feeling, especially up there. It wasn't like there were ghosts or anything, not that I believed in that stuff. But there was something unsettling about the attic that made me feel watched, like I wasn't really alone even when I was. It was like the house was somehow alive, breathing with its own rhythm, shifting when you weren't paying attention. One night, when I was 13, I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't the usual noise of creaky floorboards or the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. This time, it was different. It started with 3 loud bangs on the wall outside of my room, right next to my bed. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. It made those kinds of noises all the time, creaks and groans that seemed to echo from every corner. But this was different. The bangs were too loud, too deliberate, like someone was pounding on the wall. I froze. I could feel my heart in my throat, thudding so loud in my chest that I thought it would wake the whole house. I lay there for a second, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just the house. But then, before I could even move, something even stranger happened. The touch lamp beside my bed flickered on. It was one of those old lamps with 4 settings: off, dim, bright, and brightest. Normally, you just tap the base and it would cycle through them. But this time, the lamp started cycling on its own. Off, dim, bright, brightest. It went through the settings again and again, as if someone was tapping it constantly, but there was no one there. My stomach dropped. I reached for the lamp, but when I touched it, it was cold. It hadn't been touched, and it wasn't doing anything I had ever seen before. I turned it off, but it wasn't the only thing acting strange. From the living room, I suddenly heard the stereo blast to life. At full volume, it blared some punk album I had just discovered, music I had been listening to on repeat for the past few weeks. The sound of it filled the entire space, echoing down the hall, reverberating off the walls. I knew it was the stereo because I recognized the exact track it was playing. My heart was racing. What the hell was going on? I was frozen for a second, trying to figure out if I had somehow imagined the sound. But no, there it was clear as day. My first instinct was to get up and go check it out, but I didn't want to wake my family. I didn't want to draw attention to what felt like something wrong happening in the house. So, I slipped out of bed quietly, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't even turn the light on. The hallway was dark, but I knew it like the back of my hand. The stairs were on the other side of the wall, leading to the landing and the rest of the house. As I tiptoed down the hall, I felt my legs tremble beneath me. The sound of the music, too loud, too frantic, was driving me crazy. I reached the living room, where the stereo was sitting on a shelf. The volume knob was turned all the way up, and the speakers were pumping out sound so loud it made my ears ring. I quickly reached for the power button and turned it off. The silence that followed felt almost worse than the noise. The whole house was still again, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I stood there in the dark for a few moments, trying to shake off the chill that had spread through my body. I didn't want to go back upstairs. I didn't want to sleep in that room, in that house, with all of its creaks and groans. But I knew I had to. Slowly, I made my way back to my room, my feet moving faster than usual, almost like I was being pulled by something I couldn't see. The lamp next to my bed was still off, and the room was quiet. I sat down on the edge of the bed and turned the light on. I felt safer with the light on, but even that didn't make the house feel less strange. My mind was racing. What had just happened? There was no explanation for the noise, for the lamp cycling through its settings, for the stereo turning on by itself. It wasn't just a coincidence. I could feel it deep in my bones. Something was off. But what? I didn't know, and I didn't have an answer. So, I just sat there in the dark, waiting for the silence to calm my nerves. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember, it was morning. The sun was up, and the house didn't feel so heavy anymore. But the memory of the night before stuck with me all day, a strange unease lingering in the pit of my stomach. In the following weeks, things didn't get any better. The house seemed to grow quieter, more oppressive, especially at night. There were more instances, small things, really, that just made the atmosphere feel wrong. Sometimes, I'd hear strange thuds from the attic late at night, sounds like footsteps in the dust. And there were nights when I'd wake up to find that the door to my room was open, even though I was sure I had closed it before I went to bed. But every time I tried to mention it to my dad, he'd brush it off. He'd tell me I was just imagining things, that the house was old, and that it was bound to creak and groan and settle. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. It wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't just the way the stairs creaked under the weight of years. There was something else, something I couldn't explain, that made me feel like I wasn't the only one living there. It wasn't until years later, when I was older, that I started piecing together the strange things that happened over the years. I don't know what it was that made the house feel the way it did, whether it was the old wood settling or something more. But I know one thing, it was never just a house. It was something more. I never figured out what caused that night or the other strange occurrences. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe it wasn't. But every time I think back to that night, the bangs on the wall, the lamp, the stereo, I can't help but feel that there was something else at play in that house. I can't explain it, but I know that what happened that night wasn't just a coincidence. I left that house when I was old enough, moved out to start my own life. But even now, whenever I pass by old Victorian homes, I can't help but feel that same unease. It's a feeling I can't shake, a memory that stays with me, lingering in the back of my mind. The house may have changed, may have been renovated and fixed up, but it will always have that strange, unshakable feeling to it. I had always been the kind of person to brush off things I couldn't explain. I had a healthy skepticism about all the creepy stories people told, the strange happenings they claimed to experience. So when I moved to Florida to live in a house with 3 guys, Jason, Carl, and Mike, I wasn't expecting much. Jason owned the house, and it had been in his family for years before they moved to California. He and Carl had been living there for about a year when I decided to join them, along with Mike. I first visited a few months before moving in. The trip was meant to be a fun, low-key visit to see how things were going, and maybe help me get a feel for what it would be like to live in Florida. Jason and Carl were both cool guys, and everything seemed pretty normal at first. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, old but not run down, with a lot of space for all of us. But there were some things during that week-long visit that stuck with me. I remember one night, sitting on the couch with Jason and Carl. We were watching a movie, and every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something move, a shadow flitting past the doorway or something shifting in the hallway. At first, I figured it was just my imagination. I'd been tired from the flight and all the traveling. But as the week went on, I began to notice more things. Little things like doors being slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed them, or my phone being moved from one spot to another. Nothing huge, nothing that would make me jump to conclusions, but enough to make me feel uneasy. I didn't say anything to anyone during my visit. I figured I was probably just adjusting to a new place, maybe getting too tired, too distracted, too caught up in the novelty of it all. But when I finally moved in for good, things started happening in a way I couldn't ignore. It started slowly. A few days after I moved in, I set up an air mattress in my room. It was nothing fancy, a simple, pump-up mattress that I had brought with me. I filled it with air, tightened the cap, and went to join the guys for dinner. We were out for a couple of hours, nothing out of the ordinary. When we came back, though, the mattress was flat, completely deflated. No sound of air hissing out, no leak in sight. The cap was off, just sitting there on the floor, the mattress as flat as if someone had sucked all the air out of it. It was so strange, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to tighten the cap, or maybe it had just come loose. But no. Anyone who's ever packed one of those mattresses up knows how difficult it is to get all the air out of it. It's not something that happens on its own. I figured it was a weird fluke, maybe something with the mattress. But then, over the next few weeks, I started noticing other things. Small things at first. A book moved from one shelf to another. A kitchen towel was folded differently than I had left it. The light in the living room would flicker in a way that didn't seem right. I kept telling myself it was just me being overly sensitive, adjusting to living in a new place. I didn't want to overreact. But then, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was in the bathroom one afternoon, taking care of business, when I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but there it was, a knock. It wasn't on the door, but it was low, coming from somewhere near the base of it. Knock, knock, knock. Not a loud, forceful knock, but a soft tapping, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I froze. My heart started racing, and I quickly scanned the room, my eyes darting from the shower to the window. Nothing. The door was still shut, the hallway outside empty. But the knock, it had been real. I didn't know what to think. It could have been someone outside, maybe a neighbor, but there was no one there when I checked. I brushed it off, chalking it up to being tired or imagining things. But then it happened again. A couple of days later, I was in the bathroom again, and the same soft knocking came from the bottom of the door. Knock, 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 just as before. This time, I jumped up, opened the door, and looked around. Nothing. No one in sight. It was quiet, the house still. I didn't say anything to the guys, not at first. I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting, but it wasn't just the knocking. Over time, I started noticing something else. In the corners of my vision, I would see a figure, a shadow, like a child, darting around just out of sight. I'd see it in the hallway, in the corner of the kitchen, in the reflections of the windows. Every time I looked, it would vanish, just out of sight, like a fleeting thought. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe the lighting in the house playing tricks. But the more it happened, the more I started to question whether there was something more to it. One day, I finally mentioned it to Jason and Carl. I wasn't sure if I should. Maybe I was just being paranoid, right? But when I brought up the knocking and the shadow figure, they looked at each other, their faces changing. Jason seemed to get a little pale, and Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They told me they'd been experiencing the same things. Jason said that when he and his brother were kids, they'd see things like that too. He recalled hearing disembodied giggling in the room I was staying in, late at night, when they were young. It freaked him out, but he hadn't thought much about it at the time. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure about everything. I hadn't said anything before, because I didn't want to seem crazy, but now that Jason had mentioned it, it felt like something real. Something that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. It was as if there was something in the house that we couldn't see clearly, something lingering in the background. I decided to start paying closer attention. I tried to document what was happening. Every time I heard the knocking, I'd make a note of the time. Every time I saw the shadow figure, I'd try to focus on it, get a better look. But it never worked. I could never quite catch it. It was always just out of reach. And then the weirdest thing happened. One night, I was sitting on the couch, watching TV. The guys were all hanging out in the living room, chatting and playing some video games. I was zoning out, flipping through my phone, when I saw it, out of the corner of my eye. The shadow figure. It was standing in the hallway, about halfway down, just past the bathroom. I froze. I stared at it, not blinking, trying to get a better look. It didn't move, just stood there. I couldn't see its features, only that it was small, child-sized, and black as night. It didn't seem to have any details, just a silhouette. I didn't want to alarm anyone, so I kept my mouth shut. But the figure remained in my vision, lingering like a shadow. I finally had enough and went to bed early, closing the door behind me and turning off the lights. Over the next few days, the activity increased. I started hearing footsteps in the hallways at night, slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking around the house when no one was there. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, and hear those footsteps echoing through the house, getting closer to my room. When I checked the hall, it was empty. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if something was always just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. The worst part was that it didn't feel malicious. It wasn't like something was trying to hurt me. It was more like a presence, something that was just there lingering. Sometimes, I'd catch the faint sound of giggling, just like Jason had mentioned from his childhood. The sound would drift through the house, soft and far away, but unmistakable. It didn't scare me as much as it unsettled me. It was the kind of feeling that kept you up at night, not because you were afraid of what might happen, but because you didn't know what was going on. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I started staying at Mike's place more often, just to get away from the house. It felt like the right thing to do, just to clear my head. The house was driving me crazy. Jason and Carl had both experienced similar things, but they seemed to have grown used to it. They had been living with it for so long that it had become a part of their lives, something they just ignored. But I couldn't. The final straw came one afternoon. I had been at work all day, and when I came home, I was exhausted. I tossed my stuff down in my room and lay down on the bed, not bothering to make dinner. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the soft knocking on the bathroom door. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was louder, more deliberate, and it came from the bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. I got up and opened the door. No one was there, but I could feel it. Something was in the room with me. Something was standing in the doorway. I didn't have to look to know it was there. That was when I left. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and stayed at Mike's for good. Jason and Carl didn't push me to stay. They understood, and in a way, I think they were glad I left. I never found out exactly what was going on in that house. Maybe it was just old and creaky, with strange sounds that made your imagination run wild. Maybe it was something I'll never understand. But the truth is, I never went back. I never wanted to find out. This story is one that still feels too real to believe, and yet every detail stays burned into my mind. It's about my uncle, a man I loved dearly, a man who believed in helping others, no matter how dangerous or difficult the task. But sometimes, there are things in this world that no one can understand or fight against. Things that you can't explain with logic or faith alone. My uncle wasn't just your average man. He was a Muslim missionary, someone who dedicated his life to traveling the world, spreading the true message of Islam. His purpose was simple: to correct misunderstandings and misconceptions about his faith. He was no extremist, not in the way the world often portrayed people like him. He was a peaceful man, someone who genuinely wanted to make the world a better place. But that's what made his story even more chilling, because his intentions were pure, and yet he found himself in the grip of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. A couple of months ago, my uncle came across a village in Malaysia that was rumored to be involved in black magic. The people there, according to some reports, practiced dark rituals, and rumors even spread that they used demons to curse others. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, but my uncle wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, especially if he thought it might bring peace. When he heard about this village, he believed that perhaps he could talk to the people there, guide them away from the dark practices they were engaged in, and try to make a difference. Some in the family warned him not to go, that he might be stepping into something dangerous, but he wouldn't listen. He thought that if he could change even one person's heart, it would be worth it. So he went. He traveled to the village, bringing with him nothing but his faith and determination to make a difference. He camped there for 10 days, trying to connect with the locals, to talk to them, and to convince them that what they were doing was wrong. But as you might guess, the village wasn't interested in what he had to say. They didn't want to hear about his beliefs or his religion. They didn't care about his desire to help. Instead, they saw him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world, someone who threatened their way of life. After a few days of him continuing to preach, the villagers decided they needed to do something about him. Their methods weren't peaceful. They saw my uncle as a threat and decided the best way to deal with him was to kill him. They attempted to sacrifice him as part of some twisted ritual to appease the spirits they believed controlled their lives. But my uncle was no fool. He wasn't easily swayed, nor was he unprepared. When he realized what they were about to do, he fought back. The struggle was intense, but eventually, he managed to escape. He didn't look back. He left the village and made his way back home, shaken but alive. The family didn't know exactly what happened in that village, and neither did he. He never spoke about the details of what had occurred there, but from the moment he returned home, something about him had changed. It wasn't obvious at first. He went back to his routine, trying to go back to his work and his life. But it didn't take long for the signs to show. At first, it was small things. He seemed agitated, restless. He would stare off into space, lost in thought. He complained of hearing strange noises at night, whispers, cries, and even screams. He thought he was hearing people calling his name, even when no one was around. His family didn't know how to help him. They thought maybe he was just tired, or perhaps the trauma of what he had gone through was starting to catch up with him. But it wasn't just that. His condition worsened, and it became clear that something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained away by stress or exhaustion. Over time, he began to lose control of his emotions. He would throw things around the house, as if fighting invisible forces. Sometimes he would speak to himself in a way that made no sense, as if he were arguing with someone no one else could see. His family was patient with him at first. They tried to comfort him, to reassure him that everything would be okay. But as the days passed, his behavior became more erratic. It was as if he was trapped inside his own mind, unable to escape. The voices, the cries, the screams, they never stopped. And the worst part was that they weren't coming from the outside world. They were inside his head. They followed him wherever he went. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone was calling his name. It didn't matter if he was in a crowded room or alone in his bed, he could hear it. And sometimes, when the voices grew too loud, it was as if they were pushing him to do things he didn't want to do. He started to lash out at his family. The people who loved him the most became the targets of his frustration and fear. They didn't know how to help him anymore. They didn't understand what was happening. It went on like this for about a month. And then one day, my uncle did something that no one saw coming. He went to his room, locked the door behind him, and hung himself. There was no note, no warning. He just ended it. No one could understand why. It didn't make sense. He wasn't the kind of person who would take his own life. He had so much to live for, so much left to do. But the voices, the ones that had been tormenting him for so long, had finally driven him to the edge. They had consumed him, completely taken over his mind. It was devastating for the family. The shock was overwhelming. No one could explain what had happened to him, or why he had done it. They all wondered the same thing. Was it something he brought back from that village? Had he been cursed, as some of us suspected? No one would ever know for sure. But I believe that what happened to my uncle was the result of something darker than anything he could have imagined. He went to that village with the best intentions, thinking that he could make a difference, that he could bring light to a place steeped in darkness. But what he didn't know was that some darkness is far too powerful to fight. I can still hear the voices in my mind when I think about him. The way he changed, how the light in his eyes seemed to fade over time. It's a reminder that sometimes, even the purest intentions can lead you down a path that's impossible to escape. My uncle didn't deserve what happened to him. He didn't deserve to be consumed by the very darkness he sought to eliminate. But in the end, the curse he brought back from that village destroyed him. And so, my family and I are left with the aftermath of it all. Questions with no answers, a man who was once full of life now gone, and a lingering fear that no matter how much we may try to help others, sometimes there are things we just can't fight. We'll never know for sure what happened to my uncle in that village, but we all know one thing. There are forces out there in the world that can destroy you in ways you can't even comprehend. And once you're in their grip, there may be no way out.